Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 3341, Singing Together. Once the thunderbolts made their way into the cold prison, they would take another form. That form would allow the bald giant to kill the magical thunder slaves quite easily. But they reacted surprisingly fast, moving quickly and nimbly like eels. Crack! With the thunderous bangs, the magical thunder slaves slithered through the gaps between the giant's hands and ran off in all directions. The giant stretched and grabbed over and over, attempting to catch them again, but they kept escaping before he even knew it. In less than 30 seconds, some of the 5 element slaves had died and some had successfully fled. Only Zen, Elizabeth and Libby were left beside the cold prison. Should we leave too? Libby asked, her voice trembling. She knew escape was an almost unreasonable hope. That pair of hands would not allow them to leave so easily. But even now, she still held a glimmer of hope in her heart. When she looked at Zen, he was her rope hanging from above that she could climb to safety if things got too bad. No, Zen said firmly, shaking his head. Elizabeth and Libby could not see it, but Zen saw clearly that the bald giant stared at him with a faint smile spreading across his face. He fixed his gaze on him like a tiger stalking its prey, ready to pounce and feast on him. From this distance, escape was impossible. The only sliver of hope he had was the previous hint. He and the bald giant had a common enemy, and they both stood on the same side of this. Fleeing now would only incite an attack from the bald giant. Buzz! The light dots in the cold prison grew restless once more. The bald giant lifted his hands and slapped at the 3 of them again. Ah! Libby's long hair blew from the force of the slap and she couldn't help but scream. She had had a lot of training experience on the other shore, but she hadn't come face to face with any real serious difficulty or danger. She was thus left ill-prepared for the grave life and death situation they now found themselves in. In contrast, Zen and Elizabeth were much calmer. Elizabeth had become the leader of the divine lair after she had been through countless bloody battles and come out victorious. This was her strength. To this day, she regarded life and death as unimportant details, and Zen shared this view after similar experiences. He had always had an inkling that the bald giant was not stupid. If he still longed for freedom, they were his best shot at getting it. Whoosh! The 2 enormous hands finally came to a halt 2 or 3 feet above the divine fire shield, and then slowly withdrew towards the inside of the cold prison. Libby stopped screaming and seemed to gasp for breath. Of course, her soul did not need to breathe. It was simply an expression of relief after all the nervousness that had overtaken her. Woo! Hoo! Soon, rhythmic sounds could be heard from the cold prison, as if many people were singing together. Help me decipher it, Zen said to the green figure. After the green figure had moved from the core of the heavenly obsession civilization to the civilization artifact, it had been sitting there, paying close attention to Zen's every move. If Zen gave the order, it would activate the core of the heavenly obsession civilization immediately. The core of the heavenly obsession civilization quickly began deciphering the content and transmitted it directly to Zen's mind. He is asking if you are enemies of the element spirit race, said the green figure. Zen raised his eyebrows slightly. This question proved that his strategy had worked. Zen had wanted the bald giant to understand that he was on his side. The new issue was how to answer the giant's question. As a creature from the chaos, even if he knew how to express himself, he still couldn't actually make the correct sounds. The bald giant even could not understand the similar sounds. He had tried this before and failed. Dong! Dong! Zen hesitated in his response and the giant uncurled a finger from the depths of the cold prison and hit the surface of the ice. A rhythmic sound was heard again, exactly the same as before. Zen, he's asking us a question, right? Elizabeth asked, noticing the giant in the cold prison was getting a little impatient. Yes, he asked if we're enemies of the element spirit race, Zen replied. But how do we answer him? Elizabeth asked helplessly. I'm trying to figure that out, said Zen. Libby, who had been extremely nervous, suddenly blurted out, the souls in the Soul City are not creatures from outside the chaos, but they are capable of making the sounds of reading Sanskrit words. Zen's eyes suddenly lit up at this revelation. Yes, many souls make sounds at the same time that mix together. The pronunciation of the Sanskrit words was not made of a single syllable. When the bald giant spoke, it was as if dozens of people spoke and sang at the same time. Although the green figure had taught Zen the proper pronunciation, he would be unable to create such a complex sound alone. If there were dozens of people making sounds together, it could be possible. Zen speedily conveyed this idea to the primeval Lord of Heaven. The primeval Lord of Heaven was thinking this himself. Being very intelligent, he reacted immediately at Zen's suggestion. If there were enough people together to make the correct sounds and combine them together, they could create the same effect as the bald giant. The primeval Lord of Heaven quickly gathered the elites of the human race in the civilization artifact. At the same time, he let the core of the heavenly obsession civilization disassemble the pronunciation of the Sanskrit words. Every piece of pronunciation that contained multiple sounds was disassembled into single syllables, and each elite of the human race was responsible for uttering one single syllable. Dong, dong, dong. The bald giant hit the ice surface with his thick finger again, splashing the debris of ice in all directions. He was growing increasingly impatient. He asked the question a third time, and the smile on his face had disappeared entirely. Libby and Elizabeth looked at Zen simultaneously, hoping he would come up with a solution. Just then, more than 30 heads suddenly appeared above Zen's head. The snake goddess, Fuxi, Hui and the others uttered words as if they sang together. Yes, the element spirit race is my enemy. The bald giant obviously hadn't expected Zen to answer in this way. After a moment of amazement, a smile returned to his face. Is the element spirit race the ruler of this world? He asked. Using the core of the heavenly obsession civilization, the green figure deciphered the sentence and conveyed its meaning to Zen. The ruler of this world? No, they are nothing but cowards in this world, Zen replied. In Zen's eyes, the element spirit civilization's pursuit of the purge way was a helpless compromise to make the world peaceful. If one wanted to truly solve the crisis of chaos, they would have to rely on the finale way. Therefore, the pursuit of the purge way was a coward's venture. After Zen finished speaking, the green figure once again translated the words into complex syllables, and then disassembled them for the snake goddess, Fuxi and the others to sing together and make the composite sound. Communicating in this way was very inconvenient, but at least it could help Zen communicate with the giant. However, Fuxi, Hui and the others rolled their eyes as they sang this strange song. This task had clearly left them in a bad mood and they felt helpless in having to do it. Chapter 3342, The Magical Slipknot. After the bald giant heard the human heroes sing, he couldn't help but respond, "You are right. They are indeed a group of cowards. They set up a contemptible trap against me, and that was how they caught me." Once he finished, he gritted his teeth in pure anger. The element spirit race are quite cunning and despicable, Zen pointed out. As the core of heavenly obsession civilization translated for him, the human heroes conveyed his words using song. Exactly, what a group of deceitful mongrels. The bald giant agreed as he nodded. Such a hateful race just brought shame to all of the civilizations in the chaos. Zen continued to curse in disgust. Meanwhile, the human heroes furrowed their eyebrows in confusion while Zen cursed the element spirit civilization so passionately. Just then, the snake goddess broke the tension. Zen, what's the point of cursing the element spirit civilization this way? The primeval Lord of Heaven also looked up at Zen, revealing a look of doubt. They encouraged Zen to inquire about the bald man's background before making any impulsive actions. It would have been helpful if they knew if he was a member of the instant civilization, or if he had any knowledge on what civilizations existed in the abstruse energy world, etc. However, instead of doing so, Zen cursed profusely at the element spirit civilization, which surprised the rest of them. For them, it seemed like a meaningless bicker, especially because they all cultivated to such a high level. All of a sudden, Zen winked at them. I think we'd better go along with the giant first. Based on what the giant had done, Zen figured that he was an impulsive and willful man. Though the giant spared their lives, there was no guarantee he wouldn't return if Zen irritated him some more. This was the reason Zen echoed the giant's curses on the element spirit civilization. He wanted to gain his approval. On the other hand, this was an ordeal to the human heroes, though. While he was cursing, the heroes conveyed the translations with songs that they would not be able to understand. This process took a long while, and eventually gave time for the bald giant to cool off most of his anger. His violent aura had dissipated a lot over this time. He looked at Zen with what seemed like a look of friendliness. You look similar to me, my friend, the giant said. Are you also a member of the Colossus race? But why are you so small in size? The Colossus race. What was that? The primeval Lord of Heaven, Zen and the others repeated the phrase to themselves as they tried to see if it would ring a bell. This gave them insight that the bald giant was not alone. He had a race. I can change my body size. Look. Just then, Zen secretly activated the wild god power which sent his body to grow up to 20 feet high. He made sure to be cautious, especially because of the restriction of the divine fire shield. There was no way Zen would send himself to the ordinary size of a wild god. The giant's eyes widened at the sight of this. You can even shift your body size like a member of Colossus race. The angrier we are, the larger we can grow. The giant seemed excited to know Zen was an ally. Are we exactly from the same race? Are there any others of our kind in this world? Zen knew well that he did not belong to the Colossus race. However, he noticed the similarity in his appearance with the giant, which made him wonder if the human race did have any connection to the so-called Colossus race. But in order to be on his good side, Zen had to play smart. Hence, Zen didn't deny him, and instead, gave a vague answer and a shrug. Well, it's possible. But just as the bald giant was about to jump for joy, Zen changed the subject. As far as I know, the creatures in the cold prisons have been imprisoned for a very long time. Some have exceeded eras. My friend, do you plan to be imprisoned for a long time here as well? Hearing this, the bald giant's face shifted from excitement to infuriation. His nostrils bulged as he took heavy breaths. They can't imprison me. If they do, they will pay for it. As he spoke his last word, the bald giant pulled out a huge iron stake from his belt. The element spirit race tied up the bald giant to this iron stake at the center of the cold prison. However, under his relentless struggle, he managed to pull the stake up from the ground, and that was why he could move within the range of the cold prison. Still, he was chained, which prevented him from breaking free completely. However, the bald giant believed that the 3 chains proved no threat to him. But now that this event has happened, it won't be long before the element spirit race sends reinforcements to tie you up again. If it comes to that, you won't have another chance to escape. The bald giant wanted nothing more than freedom from the cold prison. As Zen said this, the bald giant shook his head as he realized the gravity of his situation. Even though he killed and repelled the 5 element slaves, he could not underestimate the strength of the element spirit race again. There was no way he wanted to stay imprisoned. I have to get out of this place now. The bald giant screamed, impatient and bitter. He shook and flailed around in attempt to tear the iron chain around his hands. What Zen did not know was the material used for the iron chains. Though the giant possessed immense strength, the chains were undamaged. Bang! Just then, the bald giant smashed the iron chain onto the ground. He slouched and heaved for a breath, helpless and panting. I can't destroy it. Can you try and throw the chain out of the cold prison so I can take a look? Zen asked. He summoned the primeval Lord of Heaven and the others to take a look at the chains. Zen was determined to free the giant, so that he could use the giant's power to defeat the 5 element slaves in stage 30. Can you break this chain for me? The bald giant pleaded. He stretched out his hands, showing it to Zen. Seeing it up close, the iron chain was as wide as a human being. It was bronze, while the rings were fastened tightly. The soul of the primeval Lord of Heaven floated up to get a closer look at the chain. With a light tap of his finger, lines of densely arranged runes suddenly appeared on the chain's surface. Theses runes connected to one another, resembling a chain. Pleased, the primeval Lord of Heaven smiled at such change. Just as I suspected, it's a magical slipknot. Once an iron chain is painted with this kind of runes, a magical slipknot array would form on the joints between every 2 rings. If one attempts to escape it, the chain would only tighten. Do you know how we can break the array? Zen asked impatiently. Please. The primeval Lord of Heaven brushed off his shoulder. This is a piece of cake. It was true that the magical slipknot array was not too difficult to deal with. The element spirit race never would have guessed that someone would have helped the giant solve it. After Zen told the bald giant that they could free him, his face lit up with pure excitement. In turn, he followed all their orders without another word. He obediently bent down, spread out hands, and placed them right before the primeval Lord of Heaven. Extending his hands, the primeval Lord of Heaven stroked one ring of the chain. Within seconds, a faint green light flashed from his palms. This light began to flow like a thick liquid as it made its way towards the magical slipknot array. As the green light made contact with the magical slipknot array, the array's originally golden light died down. Just then, the primeval Lord of Heaven retreated backward and merely nodded at the giant. With one stretch of his arms, the chain broke apart. Buzz! It was in this moment that Libby's and Elizabeth's visions saw the numerous light spots in the cold prison dance. Zen watched the bald giant intentionally. He noticed the giant did not expect it to be so easy, and his eyes widened at the knowledge that he was finally free. Chapter 3343, Uproar. Once the primeval Lord of Heaven unbolted the remaining 2 chains, the bald giant got to his feet and stepped out of the cold prison. The smooth ice field shone light on him, emitting a primitive, powerful aura. The bald giant squatted down and spread his hand towards Zen and said, "My friend, it's time to settle accounts with those mongrels." The core of the heavenly obsession civilization deciphered his words, causing Zen to smile. He then walked into the palm of the bald giant with Elizabeth and Libby. The ice shook as the bald giant walked on the upper ice field. The temperature here was low, but not as low as in the cold prison. The moment the frost condensed on the surface of the bald giant's body, it sizzled, turned into hot air, and disappeared. The giant's skin turned bright red, steaming heat gushing out of his body and resisting the low temperature of the ice field pretty easily. "This place is covered with ice. Where is the element spirit civilization?" the bald giant asked after they had traversed some distance. Zen was not familiar with the blooming jade stage either. But he had already walked through it once before and knew that as long as he walked in this direction to the very end, he could advance to stage 31 of the other shore. Zen was about to direct the giant in the right way when Elizabeth suddenly said, "Now that this bald giant wants to take revenge on the element spirit race, why don't we let him enjoy himself?" Enjoy himself? Zen's eyes narrowed. Since the element spirit race controls the blooming jade stage, it would be inconvenient for any other race to go up or down. Zen, your body has passed the blooming jade stage, but your soul is still in stage 29 of the other shore. If you want to go to stage 32 of the other shore, I'm afraid it will become troublesome by then. It also won't be easy for your people from the Oneness Sky Palace to pass through the blooming jade stage, Elizabeth reminded him. Zen's eyes lit up at this and he asked to clarify, "What do you mean?" "Overturn stage 30 of the other shore," Elizabeth answered with a shrug. The element spirit race had stage 30 of the other shore under full control. As a result, other races, civilizations, or powerful individual creatures on the other shore had no choice but to bear with the element spirit race when they passed through the blooming jade stage. If the base camp of the element spirit race in stage 30 of the other shore could be destroyed, other forces on the other shore, like the Nihility race, and civilizations in support of the finale way, would probably take the chance to enter the blooming jade stage. This was a good opportunity to weaken the power of the element spirit race, and there was no reason for them to miss it. "Please show him the way," Zen said, smiling. Elizabeth shrugged again. She had been traveling in the blooming jade stage for a long time and was familiar with the distribution of the ice castles belonging to the element spirit civilization. Many octagonal ice castles stood at the center of the lower ice field in the blooming jade stage. These ice castles weren't very large, but were connected to each other, forming a permanent ice city. The element spirit race had even built a thick ice wall on the outer side of the ice city. Different types of other shore creatures ventured in and out of the ice city. Souls of light, native other shore creatures, and former civilizations in the chaos were among them. All of them had one thing in common: every single race had been subject to the element spirit civilization. The atmosphere in the ice city was subdued today. Both the other shore creatures and the 5 element slaves were unusually silent. The troops formed by the Moonfire slaves, the Chill Ice slaves, and the Magical Thunder slaves had very recently suffered a great loss. Except for the Magical Thunder slaves having staged a lucky escape, all the Moonfire slaves and the Chill Ice slaves had been killed. A round platform carved with ice crystals sat at the center of the ice city. The center of this platform shimmered in a strange darkness. The dark region was so dark that no one could clearly see what was going on inside. But the creatures living in the ice city knew what it was covering. Many Moonfire slaves, Burial Earth slaves, and Chill Ice slaves surrounded the round platform and knelt down towards the dark region. They silently lowered their heads. "You are a group of losers. There were just 2 souls of light in a corporeal body. How could they kill all my Moonfire slaves and Chill Ice slaves? I really underestimated that stupid giant." Quote. The voice roared from within the dark region for quite a while before a ball slowly floated out of it. Blue ice crystals floated inside the ball. These ice crystals circled within the ball a few times before forming a little ice man. This man was Hosea, a water spirit of the element spirit race. As the ruler of stage 30 of the other shore, he had been in charge of everything in the blooming jade stage. He had dispatched troops to the upper ice field to encircle and annihilate Zen as soon as they had discovered his whereabouts. He had thought that it would be very easy to capture Zen. But in the end, his troops returned in bitter defeat and with heavy casualties. This was a result that Hosea could not accept, so he flew into a rage. He leapt lightly and his small body emerged from the ball. He looked short, but his real body was taller than a human. He waved his hands lightly and two blades appeared beside his arms. These blades were curved and glinted with cold light that none could explain. Hosea was about to lead the 5 element slaves on their journey when he spotted a soul of light flying towards them in the close distance. The soul of light was Neil, a powerful warrior of Holy Soul realm from the divine farmer race. He hurried to report his findings to Hosea. Master Hosea, Zen has come down. He is at the gate of the ice city. Hosea was stunned. He had thought that Zen would find a place to escape from the other shore after surviving the chase of the 5 element slaves. If that had really been the case, there would have been nothing that Hosea could do with Zen for the time being. He could only have pinned his hope on the Bearing race and the divine farmer race in the source world. But to his great surprise, Zen hadn't escaped. He had, instead, come to him of his own accord. Hosea was overjoyed as he muttered, "I'd like to see what tricks he wants to play." Saying thus, he floated away towards the city gate. All the 5 element slaves followed closely behind. 5 minutes before this, pieces of solid ice had suddenly fallen from above the ice city. The guards of the ice city were confused. The ice was solid and looked unlikely to fall unless external force was applied to it. The guards were still pondering over this when a figure came smashing through the upper ice field from the cave and into the gate of the ice city. "Who are you? Tell us your name." These guards were from other shore races that were dependent on the element spirit civilization. The strengths of the other shore races varied greatly, which was proven by the fact that these guards were far weaker than the 5 element slaves. However, these other shore races flourished under the protection of the element spirit civilization. Since Zen wasn't answering their questions, several guards thrust their spears towards his head. Zen's body flashed as he passed through the guards. The guards felt their eyes blur, and their hands become empty, the long spears that they had been holding appearing in Zen's hands. Swoosh! Zen threw the spears towards the ice wall, each of them stabbing into it with a terrifying force. Zen jumped up to stand on top of the ice wall with the help of the spears. He looked into the distance and smiled as he said, "We should make it bigger." Chapter 3344, The Holy Soul's Strength. Back in Stage 4 of the other shore, Zen destroyed the Bearing race's temple all on his own. That time though, his physical body held a bit of an edge against everyone since his enemies were all souls of light that had limited strength to fight back. However, this was Stage 30 of the other shore. Even the other shore creatures here held considerable power. Moreover, after upgrading to holy souls, these souls of light considerably increased their strength to the point that they could now contend with a physical body. Zen's form on top of the ice wall immediately attracted a lot of attention. Nobody ever dared to act like this in the ice city. Zen was asking for trouble. Where did this reckless human brat come from? Not far away was a platform where numerous burly creatures, covered in silver scales and with huge heads of golden hair, stood. They were members of the Scale Lion race, which used to be the ruling civilization during the 337th Chaos. This race had a good relationship with the element spirit civilization and paid direct allegiance with them after entering the other shore. They were extremely loyal among all of the other shore civilizations. Their hostility towards Zen was natural after the man made his invasion known. Howl, accompanied by a burst of primitive roars, the members of the Scale Lion race suddenly jumped together and began to scale the ice wall, headed straight towards Zen. One thing about the Scale Lion race was that they did not rely on their theurgy to fight and instead cultivated a special fighting instinct that helped them deal fatal blows upon their opponents. They were mean fighting machines who knew how to strike and defend effectively. If an opponent was on par to their strength, then the Scale Lion race would be invincible. However, if the opponent was stronger, the increase of the Scale Lion race's strength would be limited. Zen's physical body was already at maximum power courtesy of the body-strengthening jades, and add to that the support of the chaotic source spirits. There was no need to take these approaching creatures seriously given his current strength. The only ones he had to watch out for were the 5 element slaves. The moment the first Scale Lion reached him, Zen bent forward and threw a wicked punch towards his opponent's abdomen. Scale Lions, as their name suggested, were covered with extremely hard scales save for their bellies. Zen's strike was incredibly powerful and was enough to break all his internal bones. One punch was all it took to eliminate the first opponent, but the second one was already stretching out his sharp claws towards Zen's head. Zen was faster and he was able to strike first. Afterward, he clasped the sharp claws headed for him and spun violently. He used the scale lion as a weapon against his companions. Bang, 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 several scale lions failed to dodge and were directly smashed onto the ice wall. Zen grabbed a few of them and threw them up to a height of hundreds of feet into the air before they fell down and crashed onto a nearby building. Zen found himself looking into the distance. The noise is nowhere near loud enough to attract attention, he mumbled to himself. He was here to mess things up, which meant the louder he was, the better. Just as he thought up of ways to make a bigger commotion, he heard a voice speak to him. You are incredibly fearless, but it is time to stop. The voice shocked Zen greatly. He quickly whipped around to see a figure dash behind him. It was a human soul of light that held a huge ink brush. With unbelievable dexterity, he drew the brush and flicked a stroke towards Zen. Zen noticed that something was wrong, so he wanted to keep his distance from this person. This person was only a soul of light, but his bodily movement was incredibly mysterious and amazing. He was like a maggot that kept following Zen's moves. Swish, swish, the second stroke of his brush landed directly on Zen's chest. The third stroke, the fourth stroke, the fifth stroke. During this barrage of attacks, Zen exhausted all means to dodge, counterattack, and even soar into the air. Unfortunately for him, the soul of light continued his pursuit and left behind many strokes on his body. The stroke is incomparable, making the mountains and stars move. Seal. The soul of light uttered, after suddenly drawing 7 strokes on Zen's body. It felt as if these brush strokes came to life like snakes that coiled around Zen's entire body and tightly wrapped around him. He felt his power within him sealed as he smashed onto the ice wall. With Zen effectively restrained, the soul of light slowly approached with his ink brush propped on his shoulder. Although Zen couldn't see his face clearly, he could see that the soul of light resembled an old man with a stooping body. This old man's name was Reed and he came from the divine farmer race. He was a high-ranking warrior at the Holy Soul Realm, and had been active in Stage 32 of the Other Shore for a long time now. Ha ha, you're a daring one, aren't you? You successfully blocked the Sun Crow race's invasion and now even dared to enter the Blooming Hade stage. Reed said with a faint smile. As he spoke, Zen couldn't help but shift his eyes to the large brush the old man carried. This ink brush was a unique magic treasure called the Dragon Sealing Brush. With Reed's soul theurgy, it had the ability to seal everything, even the powerful warriors on the other shore. There was no way Zen would be able to attack, now that he was sealed. He could only lie on the ground and stare at the old man with indifference. He didn't expect for an old man who had reached the Holy Soul Realm to be his match. Since you had the guts to break into the Ice City, you're as good as dead. The Element Spirit race will be very happy if I hand you over to them, Reed continued, stretching out a hand to lift Zen up. However, the moment Zen got to his feet, the strokes that restrained him suddenly broke free. Reed's eyes widened in horror as he immediately let go of Zen and took a few steps back. How is that possible? Bang! There was no time to ponder over that, as Zen instantly threw him a punch square on the face. Though it had been a long time since he reached the Holy Soul Realm and the stability of his soul was comparable to that of a physical body, Reed still suffered greatly from the man's attack. As his soul was smashed into the air, he found it best to retreat from the other shore. Puff! Somewhere in the source world was a palace and in this palace sat the old man, Reed. The moment he opened his eyes, he spat out a mouthful of blood and suddenly fainted. He did not know that in the eyes of the primeval Lord of Heaven, his unique sealing theurgy was a mere party trick. When he sealed Zen, the primeval Lord of Heaven made quick work of negating the magic and reminded the man to launch a surprise attack once Reed approached. Zen shook his head. This holy soul really is so strong. This is indeed unexpected. He thought his punch would have been enough to smash Reed's holy soul to ashes, but the strength of the old man's soul exceeded his expectations. Chapter 3345, Falling from the Sky. Another human warrior at the Holy Soul Realm stood in an ice pavilion. It was Neil of the Divine Farmer race. Neil was the equal of Reed in terms of strength. When Neil saw Reed being forced out of the other shore by Zen's punch, he was astonished, though he tried to conceal it. Obviously, Reed had wanted to capture Zen so that he could ask for rewards from the Element Spirit race. The Element Spirit race was known for the generosity of its rewards, which its members used as a means of controlling others and obtaining what they wanted. However, not only had Reed been unable to catch Zen, he had also sustained serious injuries. Reed's failure convinced Neil that it would not be a good idea to go forward. He quietly retreated. His human-shaped soul of light disintegrated into a series of slender threads, which shivered in the air like visible wind spreading into the depths of the Ice City. It would also be a great achievement to be the one to bring the news to the stage ruler, Hosea. That human brat defeated the scale lion race. And he threw a holy soul out of the other shore. I know who he is. He is the one whom Master Hosea is hunting down. Many of the 5 element slaves have been killed while hunting him. He is too arrogant. How dare he come to the Ice City? You must catch him. The news of Zen's feat spread to the strange-shaped creatures of the other shore, and it caught their attention immediately. They were intrigued and wanted to know more about Zen. They took an interest in Zen for the same reason as Reed. Since Zen was wanted by the element spirit race, his capture would lead to enormous rewards. Come on, let's go. Several short-statured creatures, shaped like giant beetles, were gathered by the side of the city gate. In a moment, they spread their wings and rose into the air, gliding along the ice wall and heading straight towards Zen. Bang, bang, bang. As soon as they drew nearer to Zen, to their shock, the shadow of a fist had approached and smashed them down along the ice wall. But as soon as the giant beetles had been smashed down, dozens of birds appeared in the air, flying towards Zen. These birds were small, no larger than a human fist, but they had long beaks, at least 3 feet in length. They also flew much faster than the beetles. They zoomed like living arrows towards Zen. No ordinary creature could block such an attack by these deadly birds. However, Zen was in possession of the chaotic source spirits, which made his body an impenetrable fortress. If the birds tried to pierce him with their beaks, he knew that the consequences would be terrible for them. His body was like rigid stone. Indeed, as soon as the birds reached Zen, their sharp, slender beaks broke upon contact with his body. Their tiny warm bodies slammed into him next, and were pulverized by the impact into a mist of blood and feathers. For the birds, it had been a suicide attack. Even as the flock of birds died, 2 more monsters showed up. They were large, stooping figures carrying pots of poison. They climbed the ice wall and positioned themselves above Zen, sprinkling their multicolored liquid venom over his body. But Zen was immune to all poisons. He shook off the venom and leapt up to kick the monsters from their perch on the wall. Still, no matter how easily Zen fended off the attacks, more and more other shore creatures showed up. Many were eager to claim the reward promised by the element spirit race, and soon Zen was surrounded. He was preparing to fight all of them when a chill swept through the air. A cold wind was blowing in, and the temperature suddenly dropped severely. Zen and the other shore creatures turned to look in the direction of the wind. In the distance, a large blue shadow was moving towards them. As it progressed, it seemed to infect everything it passed. The snow-white buildings of the ice city turned a dark blue, and the temperature became even colder. The blue shadow was followed by many moon fire, magical thunder, and chill ice slaves. "It's Master Hosea," cried someone. "Master Hosea is here in person. This arrogant human brat has met his match now. He has to pay the price for his wild actions. Death." Zen listened to the words of those creatures below the ice wall, his gaze fixed firmly on the looming blue shadow. He said softly, "It seems that the master has arrived. How powerful is Hosea?" "Hosea is a figure of significance within the element spirit civilization," the primeval Lord of Heaven replied. "But the truly powerful existences of the element spirit civilization are all in stage 33. The most important stage on the other shore was stage 33. In the eyes of the element spirit civilization, stage 33 was the land of exploration. All the lower stages were merely distractions, areas that needed to be managed and maintained. As Hosea approached, the temperature continued to drop, until everyone felt the bite of the cold. On the ice wall, the growing frost formed beautiful polygonal condensation patterns, like ice flowers. Most of the other shore creatures began backing away from Zen. They grew quiet and watched Hosea coming nearer and nearer. In a few moments, Hosea reached the opposite side of the ice wall, floating in midair. His sharp eyes fixated immediately on Zen, but there was a look of puzzlement in his expression. "I'm curious," said Hosea calmly. "You managed by luck to defeat the 5 element slaves, but you must have known retribution would follow. You should have hidden yourself in the source world. What gives you the courage to break into my ice city?" As a member of the element spirit civilization, Hosea had passed the Soul City and the land of bone tribulation. He had also entered the eternal scroll painting. As a master at the eternal realm, Hosea possessed an immensely powerful aura. It was like thousands of sharp knives hidden within his body, and he could exert enormous pressure on those within his range. Zen met Hosea's fierce gaze without any fear. When Hosea had spoken, Zen smiled faintly and answered, "Courage is not a problem for me. I have never been afraid to go after what I want." "That's not courage, that's stupidity," Hosea said in a cool tone. He raised his hands, and the blades on both sides of his arms flickered with an icy light. The other shore creatures and the 5 element slaves formed a wide circle around Hosea and Zen, watching in wide-eyed silence. The sight of Hosea engaged in battle was something rare and unexpected. It has been tens of thousands of years since the last time Master Hosea fought, right? We might never have the chance to see anything like this again. Unfortunately, Hosea's opponent is too weak for him, someone observed in a disappointed voice. Hosea was a stage ruler at the Eternal Realm, an existence of incomparable power. Most of the watchers felt that Hosea's talent would be wasted on killing someone like Zen who was so much weaker. In fact, some thought privately that Hosea should just leave Zen to them, as he was not worth Hosea's personal attention. Too weak, Zen repeated. He chuckled and said, "Well, why don't we see what strength I can summon?" Zen was clearly unafraid, and his words caused murmurs and looks of confusion in everyone around him, even Hosea. At that moment, there was a loud crackling sound in the air above them. Cracks were forming on the thick frost covering the upper ice field. In seconds, it splintered into shards that fell in heavy, razor-sharp shards onto the ground. They heard a deep boom. The huge ice piece shrouded an ice castle, which was also smashed into pieces. Some of the ice splinters landed on other shore creatures, killing them before they could react. To everyone's shock, as the ice piece fell, a huge, hulking figure jumped down to stand beside Zen. There was a thud as his weight landed solidly on the ground. It was a bald giant. The thick ice wall couldn't bear the force of his landing, and collapsed. Many other shore creatures stared at the strange giant in open-mouthed disbelief. A giant descending from the upper ice field. How had such a creature survived in a land of extreme chillness without the protection of the divine fire shield? Just what kind of existence was this giant? To their further astonishment, the giant moved his lips and began emitting strange words. It seemed that the bald giant was singing without any recognizable tone or rhythm. Zen listened attentively. The core of heavenly obsession civilization had sent out the contents it had deciphered. Zen gazed at Hosea and said evenly, "This guy of the Colossus race told you that he'd met you again." Hosea's eyes widened in recognition and shock. He was astonished that the bald giant had escaped from the cold prison. Yet he was even more stunned that Zen was capable of understanding what the bald giant said. Chapter 3346, Fight. The element spirit civilization had naturally thought of many ways to communicate with the creatures outside the chaos. Like most other civilizations, they wanted to gain rich experience so they could decipher Sanskrit words, the light dots, and even their voices. Sanskrit words were the text, the light dots were the form, and the voices were the verbal expression. Among the 3 of them, the words were the easiest to decipher. Every ruling civilization that had passed through the chaos had done profound studies on the Sanskrit words, and the element spirit civilization was no exception. However, it was extremely difficult to decipher the form and the verbal expression. For instance, the creatures in the chaos weren't capable of entering the abstruse energy world, which was their innate limitation. Nevertheless, it was possible to break such a limitation. For example, Zia gradually adapted to the rules of the abstruse energy world after countless years of exploration. The only thing was, that way of adapting was quite inefficient, and that was why Zia still couldn't exit a mountain even after so many years. Then again, his explorations were only one individual's efforts. As the oldest civilization, the element spirit civilization had many talents in the element spirit race, who when they explored together, could surely find out more about the abstruse energy world than he did. Furthermore, the element spirit civilization even knew how to fight and set traps. Over the years, they had captured a considerable number of creatures in the abstruse energy world just to understand how the civilizations there worked. All the creatures they had captured from the abstruse energy world were brought to the other shore and detained in the cold prisons. They built the cold prisons in such a way that their temperature was always at an immensely low level. Not only were the cold prisons very suitable for holding creatures from outside the chaos, but they also helped the element spirit race study them. Aside from that, they also made a series of detailed plans to capture those creatures, but they never got to carry out those plans smoothly. Many people from the element spirit civilization died in the abstruse energy world during their first attempts. That was because the element spirit civilization was not good at fighting in the abstruse energy world. After some careful consideration, they changed the strategies of their plans. They might not be able to defeat those creatures in the abstruse energy world, but they believed that they could defeat them on the other shore. If they set up a bait, they could gradually lure the creatures from the abstruse energy world to the other shore. The moment those creatures arrived at the other shore, the people of the element spirit civilization would surround and capture them. Although it was a despicable method, it was quite useful. They eventually carried out the plan, and as a result, the number of creatures in the cold prisons began to increase rapidly. But even after the element spirit civilization studied them for a long time, they still weren't satisfied. The reason was that the trap that the element spirit civilization had set up was rather simple. It consisted of just putting food as bait in the abstruse energy world and luring those creatures with it. Then, almost all the creatures in the abstruse energy world who were fooled by the food bait were low level. Those creatures did not possess intelligence. Aside from their fighting instinct and strange howls, they were useless. It was even more impossible to learn about any civilization in the abstruse energy world by studying them. Despite that, the element spirit race couldn't find a better way. In the end, there was nothing they could do except setting up the traps in a more sophisticated way. Finally, one day, a bait had attracted a member of the Colossus race, and that creature accidentally fell into the element spirit civilization's trap. It turned out to be the bald giant, and the whole element spirit civilization was in an uproar at the capture. Even though the element spirit civilization pursued a very conservative way, which was the purge way, they were always eager to know more about the world outside the chaos. They wanted to use the purge way to delay the end of the chaos as much as possible, and at the same time, they wanted to explore the abstruse energy world to find another method of ending. After a long time, they finally caught an intelligent member of the Colossus race. How could they not be excited? Their excitement faded when, even after 2 years of imprisonment, the element spirit civilization didn't get anything out of the bald giant. They hadn't even understood his language. Still, the bald giant hadn't been in prison for a long time yet, so most of the element spirit race was still optimistic. They believed that they would get the information they needed sooner or later, as long as the bald giant was in prison. Yet, they never imagined that Zen would release the bald giant purely out of a series of coincidences. You can talk to this bald giant?" Hosea asked Zen in disbelief. Zen only shrugged and didn't say yes or no. "Tell me," Horsey shouted. At that moment, his whole body turned into an azure flying shuttle and charged straight towards Zen's head. Before he could reach the ice wall, a huge fist fell from the sky. Pop! The bald giant smashed Hosea to the ground with a loud crunch. As soon as the fist touched the ground, a visible shock wave formed around it. The shock wave swept over the ice walls, ice castles, and ice crystal buildings, and all of them were crushed into bits. More than half of the ice city was destroyed like that. My ruler, the fist of the bald giant is truly powerful. I wonder if Master Hosea is all right. All the other shore creatures and 5 element slaves who witnessed the scene became worried and panicked. A few seconds later, all of them sighed in relief. Wisps of white frost spiraled up along the bald giant's fist. As the white frost condensed, it turned into a thick layer of ice and wrapped around the giant fist. Hosea's face was on the bald giant's arm, but the face was looking at Zen. "Ha, did you think you would win by releasing this guy?" Buzz. The cold air quickly spread to the bald giant's torso, legs, neck, head. In the blink of an eye, the ice had frozen the bald giant on the spot and rendered him motionless. Hosea slipped out of the bald giant's arm and stared coldly at Zen. "Tell me, how did you communicate with him?" he sneered. In turn, Zen was a little shocked at the sudden turn of events. If the bald giant really didn't have any other ability, he probably shouldn't have broken into the ice city. When Hosea saw that Zen didn't say anything, he jumped up once again. He stretched both of his hands, which held 2 curved wing-like blades, then flew towards Zen. The moment he jumped, a shattering sound came from behind him. The giant hand once again grabbed him. Crack! A cracking sound came from the bald giant's palm. Hosea's body was crushed into pieces. However, Zen's face didn't relax when he heard the sound. It was because he knew that the element spirit race evolved from various elements, so it wasn't easy to kill them. For instance, the chill ice slaves and the moon fire slaves had spiritual cores. If their spiritual cores were damaged, they would die. On the other hand, the magical thunder slaves had no spiritual cores, and the bald giant couldn't seem to kill them. Since Hosea was a water spirit among the spirits with 5 elements, it was impossible to kill him with just violence. In the next moment, Zen's prediction became true. Wisps of white frost spread out from the bald giant's palm once again, turned into thick ice, and tightly wrapped around his body. Chapter 3347, The Earthwood Seal. The solidified ice was more stable than the last one, and on it were blue patterns. Hosea came out of the ice and didn't stop at all. In a split second, he flew up high into the sky, and part of his limbs turned into an ice spear that was over 10,000 feet long. Suddenly, Hosea spun his body around and the ice spear shot to the bald giant. Crack! Although the ice spear was truly powerful, it failed to pierce through the bald giant's body. Hosea frowned when he realized that he couldn't injure the bald giant with his own strength. Thus, he floated up again and condensed a second ice spear. Crack! This time, the icy blue spear pierced through the bald giant's armpit. Then, Hosea condensed more ice spears immediately after. Dozens of ice spears shuttled down from all directions and repeatedly punctured the bald giant until he was firmly fastened on the ground. Hosea then stopped when he felt that the bald giant was finally subdued. After he took a look at his work, his lips curved into a satisfied smile. Then, he slowly floated towards Zen. There was a big hole in the upper ice field, which would take some time to repair itself. A cold wind blew across the whole ice city, which made the whole place's temperature drop sharply. At the same time, Libby and Elizabeth also felt their hearts drop. For their safety, the two women didn't go down to the lower ice field with Zen and the bald giant. Besides, Elizabeth had previously spent a lot of effort melting the ice for the bald giant to go down. The divine fire shield covered the two women as they observed the situation from the upper ice field. The bald giant is lame. Libby said, "You shouldn't have let Zen make such a dangerous move." She glared at Elizabeth. Elizabeth stayed silent for a moment before she said, "I did overestimate his strength." Indeed, the bald giant was powerful when it came to strength and defense. Even the ice spears Hosea had thrown with all his might failed to cause even the slightest damage to the bald giant. So Hosea could only seal him. However, the bald giant didn't know how to kill Hosea either. He couldn't do anything to the ever-changing water spirit like Hosea. That was why when Zen saw Hosea float towards him, he automatically increased his guard. His strength was truly beyond Zen's expectations. "Primeval Lord of Heaven, is there any way to defeat this water spirit?" Zen asked. Even the magical thunder slave he had encountered before couldn't be killed with brute force, but after the primeval Lord of Heaven used the imprisoning lightning, he transformed into another form and became easy to kill. Yes, the primeval Lord of Heaven nodded. It was safe to say that in the whole human race and even among the civilizations on the other shore, the primeval Lord of Heaven probably knew the element spirit civilization best. He had his way of restraining the 5 element spirits. The 5 element spirits don't have forms, which makes it hard to kill them, but after a long time of being in conflicts with them, the civilizations that insisted on the finale way finally came up with some methods. Back then, the civilizations that believed in the finale way had also privately exchanged methods on how to deal with the element spirit civilization. The water spirits did not have a form, but that didn't mean that they were completely flawless. The most common method against them was fire attacks. They could be burned and sealed with strong fire until their forms completely disappeared, then they died. Could you possibly use such a method? Zen asked again. We're just energy souls. My previous attacks relied on the civilization artifact, so I can't fight against a water spirit at the eternal realm with my energy soul, the primeval Lord of Heaven said and shook his head. If the real god of fire, Jirong, was with them, he could fight Hosea with the fire attack. Still, the fire the energy soul of Jirong released wasn't enough to threaten Hosea. But there is another method, the primeval Lord of Heaven continued. It is somewhat similar to the imprisoning lighting. You need to transform the water spirit into another form, then kill him. This way is called the Earthwood Seal, but it's also very difficult to seal Hosea. Most importantly, you need to be strong enough to kill him after you seal him, the primeval Lord of Heaven explained. As the primeval Lord of Heaven spoke, the human race's book began to turn over, and a triangular rune flew out from a particular page. On the top of the rune was a water-shaped pattern, and on both sides of the bottom were earth and wood-shaped patterns. When Zen, who was now a little desperate, heard those words, his heart skipped a beat. Even if the primeval Lord of Heaven felt that it was hard for Zen to resist, the Earthwood Seal would still give him a chance to counterattack. Just as Zen was still communicating with the primeval Lord of Heaven, Hosea was already in front of him. At the same time, he raised the blades in his hands, as if he was going to chop Zen's head at any time. I'll give you one last chance. How did you understand the bald giant's language? He hissed. Zen's gaze crossed Hosea as he stared at the bald giant behind him. Even though the bald giant was sealed and unable to move, his eyes were still flexible. His angry red eyes were still visible through the dark blue ice. The bald giant had just escaped from the cold prison, but Hosea froze him just now. Everyone could only imagine how angry he was. Anger could make him stronger. The bald giant had once mentioned to Zen their source of strength. Perhaps, Hosea's ice seal might not be able to seal the bald giant in the end. Therefore, Zen thought quickly and made a decision. He wasn't sure if the bald giant could break through ice around him, but at that point, Zen couldn't do anything but delay things and give the bald giant more time to break through the ice. Primeval Lord of Heaven, please give me the Earthwood seal. Zen communicated to his inner world. Of course, the Primeval Lord of Heaven did not hesitate. He extended his hand and gently pointed at the triangle rune. The triangle rune spun a few times, then it turned into a golden beam of light and flew towards the sky. Buzz! Once the rune was out from his inner world, Zen held it in his hand. When he saw that Hosea had gotten a little impatient, he immediately said, because of deciphered his language. Deciphered his language? Hosea narrowed his eyes in doubt. The element spirit civilization had also tried to do this before. However, the bald giant's language was very complicated, and every enunciation could mean multiple things. The element spirit civilization was not as good as the calculation civilization in calculation. It would probably take them a long time to decipher the language after taking so many possibilities into account. The element spirit civilization was also aware of it. That was one of the reasons why they froze the core of the heavenly obsession civilization. The green figure had previously told Zen that the element spirit civilization couldn't destroy the core of the heavenly obsession civilization. But in fact, they could do this if they wanted. The truth was, the element spirit civilization just wanted to control the core of the heavenly obsession civilization at the right time, so they naturally didn't want to destroy it. Chapter 3348, The Method of Dodging. Zen met Hosea's eyes and made a gesture with his finger. I simply used the Sanskrit deciphering method to understand his language. He was, of course, spouting nonsense, but it wasn't entirely baseless. There was bound to be some similarity between Sanskrit words and the bald giant's language, but the latter was definitely far more difficult to understand. However, his claims attracted Hosea's attention. The Sanskrit deciphering method, he repeated. Hosea's eyes shone with intrigue as he looked at Zen. Which civilization's rules did you use? The human civilization. There were numerous methods in deciphering Sanskrit and every civilization developed their own. The element spirit civilization once consolidated and summarized all these methods. Since Zen was human, Hosea naturally thought that he used the human civilization's rules. Human civilization's rules? Zen repeated with a smile before he shook his head. No, I found a lost other shore civilization in stage 26 of the other shore that summarized the method. Thus began Zen's long, drawn-out tale of complete, utter nonsense. All sorts of secrets were hidden on the other shore and not even the element spirit civilization knew everything. It was not difficult for Zen to fool Hosea with wild, elaborate, and vivid descriptions, and the latter could only listen patiently. It didn't matter whether Zen was lying or telling the truth. At the end of the day, stage 30 was Hosea's territory. Everything was under his control here. As Zen continued his nonsensical tale, he noticed the bald giant's eyes get redder and redder while his face got even more distorted. Bang! To his horror, the solid ice that encased the bald giant shattered with a loud bang. The bald giant's skin turned blood red as it expanded. Infinite power burst out from his body and the ice spears that trapped him snapped one by one. Boom! Once free from the ice seal, the bald giant stepped forward and the whole ice city began to shake. Whoosh! With stunning agility, the giant's blood-red fist rushed towards Hosea's head. Hosea merely responded with a mocking smile. He was an immortal water spirit and it was impossible to kill him with just brute force. When the huge fist smashed down upon him, Hosea made no move to dodge. All he needed to do was blink and the bald giant would freeze once again. At that moment, Zen's eyes flashed and he finally made his move. He had the triangular earthwood seal imprinted on his palm and the distance between him and his target was only 10 feet. Whoosh! He took a step forward and was able to bridge the gap between him and Hosea. Hosea turned around with a look of confusion on his face. Perhaps it was due to his arrogance that he did not think for a second that Zen would be able to hurt him. Instead of dodging, Hosea merely sneered at the oncoming attack. However, the moment he saw the imprint on Zen's palm, he froze. The earthwood seal. There was no way that a water spirit like him wouldn't know what that was. This seal had taken countless water spirits' lives. How in the world could it be here in stage 30, his domain? Just as Hosea came to a sinking realization, it was already too late for him to dodge. Zen's palm had already landed on his back and imprinted the earthwood seal. A water spirit had the ability to morph into whatever shape he wanted. If Hosea willed it, he could integrate himself with the entirety of the Ice City. In fact, it could also be said that the Ice City itself was part of his body already. However, the moment the earthwood seal landed on his back, his entire body turned a sick shade of brownish yellow. The former water spirit seemingly turned into an earth spirit as tender branches began to burst out of his body layer by layer. You. In this moment of crisis, Hosea could only stutter in frustration. He was unable to change shape because of the earthwood seal, and he would definitely die under this heavy blow. With rage in his eyes, Hosea let out a desperate, horrifying scream. "Let's die together then," he shouted as he stretched out his arms and wrapped them around Zen with branches from within his body. At the sudden barrage of branches, Zen did his best to twist his way out. Unfortunately, though the earthwood seal transformed Hosea's entire constitution, it did nothing to lessen his strength. As a powerful Eternal Realm warrior, and despite the pressure of Stage 30 of the other shore, Hosea's strength remained superior. There was no way Zen could get rid of his branches at all. "You want to break away from me?" Hosea sneered. His branches wrapped around Zen even tighter, and the huge fist quickly pressed the two of them to the ground. Zen grit his teeth as he struggled in vain. "I can't break free, but you seem to have overlooked something." He paused and did not continue until they were only 10 feet away from the ground. "I can exit the other shore." Hosea was evidently struck dumb when he heard this. He had completely forgotten to use the soul restraining sand on Zen. As a result, the tightly wrapped Zen was able to disappear. The man had already recited the illusion-breaking rune in advance, and Hosea only had time to shout a curse before he fell into eternal darkness. Boom! The explosion was deafening and the ground trembled under the sorrowful pounding of the bald giant. My friend. He could have never left the cold prison without Zen's help and viewed him as a close ally. The bald giant understood the situation but couldn't take his fist back. Libby and Elizabeth, who were on the upper ice field, were struck dumb at what they had just witnessed. Elizabeth was even more distraught. To her, Zen and Emperor Charm were already one, and Zen was the only one she could follow. To see him die this way was an extremely difficult thing to accept. Meanwhile, Zen had quietly returned to the other shore and heard the bald giant's sad song. He smiled and whistled low. When the bald giant saw Zen reappear, he immediately pounded on his chest in excitement. Both Elizabeth and Libby were also wide-eyed in shock. It seemed that Zen did not die but just withdrew in order to dodge that fatal blow. As for the 5 element slaves, they were, in one word, dumbfounded. Master Hosea is still alive. The stage ruler just hid himself. He's just waiting for a chance to give the bald giant a fatal blow. They could not believe Hosea would die this way. It was a known fact that the Blooming Jade stage was controlled by Hosea and he held absolute authority over it. At that moment, a circle of light rose from the ground and flew towards the bald giant's head. With a slight fluctuation of light, the bald giant disappeared. When a stage ruler was killed, the one who killed him would be heralded as the new stage ruler. The appearance of the circle of light signified the bald giant's new role as ruler of the Blooming Jade stage. It was only then that Hosea's death was confirmed to the 5 element slaves. The entire Blooming Jade stage was now set for a lot of changes. Chapter 3349, Wipe Out. The other shore creatures in the Ice City hid in every corner of the ice castles. From there, they observed the battle without having to worry about getting hurt. When they realized that Hosea had died, everyone was washed over with a wave of sadness. Neil, the powerful Holy Soul Realm warrior of the Divine Farmer race, was no exception to this. He frowned and left quietly. Even if Hosea was not among the most powerful warriors of the Element Spirit race, he still held a special status. His death would mean the loss of the Blooming Jade stage. Knowing this, Neil had to inform Divine Farmer as soon as possible. Aside from a small group of the Souls of Light, most of the other shore creatures were at a loss. They had no clue what would happen to the Blooming Jade stage. Should they retreat, or would it be smarter to stay in the Ice City? Master Hosea really died. That human brat. It is all his fault. He killed Master Hosea. Within seconds, the 5 element slaves were in a rage. At this point, retreating was not an option anymore, and they charged madly at Zen. However, though the 5 element slaves were very powerful, they didn't have any high positions in the Element Spirit race. After all, they were merely slaves created by the Element Spirit race in the first place. Seeing the 5 element slaves rush towards him, Zen remained calm and unmoved. Because he could not put up a fight, he decided it would be best to dodge. With a light tap of his toe against the ground, he glided backwards to create distance. As he saw the magical thunder slave in the front aiming for his head, his figure faded away and he exited the other shore. He ran away. What a coward! He retreated from the other shore again. What should we do now? Since their main target disappeared, the 5 element slaves did not know what to do. After all, they were only capable of carrying out tasks. With their leader dead, they did not know how to continue. However, their confusion did not last long. Not long after, a ray of white light shone, revealing a huge figure. Before, it took Zen much effort to eventually become the ruler of stage 14 of the other shore. However, the bald giant came from outside of the chaos. He had a skill for comprehending Sanskrit words, so understanding the theurgy on the slate was a piece of cake for him. Once he returned, the bald giant gave the 5 element slaves cold looks. He ground his teeth against each other in anger. He hated the element spirit race. Whoosh! With one deep breath, the giant smashed his fist directly towards the moonfire slave that was in front of him. At this point, the moonfire slaves and chill ice slaves realized something was wrong. They began to flee and flail in all directions, running without thinking. But no matter how fast they ran, they could never escape the bald giant. Thump, thump, thump. The bald giant's first punch didn't hit the moonfire slave, so he chased the slave down and began smashing his fist randomly. The moonfire slaves crawled like crippled bugs on the ground. With a hit, their armors and spiritual cores were smashed into pieces. On the other hand, the chill ice slaves had it a little better. Because they transformed into various flying forms and scattered in all directions. They were much harder to target. There still happened to be a few chill ice slaves that were hit, but other than that, the rest were safe. As for the magical thunder slaves, they were probably the safest among the slaves. The bald giant did not have an effective way to deal with them, especially because they launched attacks on his weakest body parts. However, these tactics only caused weak damage to the giant. After one round of the battle, the bald giant had no serious injuries, which sent the magical thunder slaves to retreat. By the time Zen returned to the other shore, he saw that the 5 element slaves on the ice field had almost been killed by the bald giant. As for the other creatures on the other shore, a few decided to escape, while the others didn't intend to resist. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Libby didn't descend from upper ice field until they caught sight of Zen. The central ice city has been taken. Anything else? Zen asked them calmly. It would be easy to occupy the remaining several ice castles, Elizabeth smiled. Besides, the bald giant became the stage ruler. Let's see if he has any interest in hunting down the element spirit race. I might as well ask him, said Zen. Just then, the energy souls of Fuxi, Hui, Emperor Charm, the snake goddess and the rest hovered over Zen's head again and began to sing their song. After he finished, Fuxi's face looked disgusted. When will this end? Singing stupid songs was not part of what he signed up. He hated it, especially because no one could understand them. Very soon, the snake goddess comforted him. Primeval Lord of Heaven is training the rest. It won't be long until they take our places. The singing was necessary for Zen to communicate with the bald giant. Without the songs, the bald giant wouldn't have understood anything. Anyway, these songs were simple to create. They just needed to make some sounds that ordinary warriors could do. With this, the primeval Lord of Heaven recruited some people in Zen's inner world to take the place of the elites who had helped Zen pronounce. When the bald giant heard the singing, his eyebrows raised in interest. The other several ice castles. I won't let go of anyone from the element spirit race. The giant had a deep hatred for the element spirit race. There was no way he'd let them off so easily. 2,000 miles away from the ice city stood 3 ice castles, strategically connected to one another. These ice castles were meant to be the gathering places, second only to the ice city in the blooming jade stage. The news of the fallen ice city and Hosea's death had not spread yet, so the 5 element slaves in the ice castles were unaware of the crisis. Thump, thump, thump. As the ice-covered earth trembled, the other shore creatures and the 5 element slaves made their way out of the ice castles. With a clear view of who coming over, their faces shifted from calm to anxious. Chaos struck, and everyone ended up shouting, dodging, and running as fast as they could. Within 5 minutes, the 3 ice castles were left to ruins. On the other hand, with the guidance of Elizabeth, the bald giant charged towards the next nearest gathering place. It was in these 3 days that the blooming jade stage was far from peaceful. Over time, the ice castles built by the element spirit race were completely destroyed to dust, all by the bald giant. Meanwhile, the 5 element slaves and the other shore races who were obedient to the element spirit race suffered great losses. None of them had any good plans to deal with the giant, which led them to surrender. It was their only choice, death or retreat. The races on the other shore appeared innocent, but neither Elizabeth nor Zen had any intentions of letting them off so easily. The fact that they joined the element spirit race meant that they had to stick to their stance. After all, if the element spirit race was ever in trouble, the creatures on the other shore would not hesitate to aid them. After 3 days passed and the chaos subsided, the bald giant carried Zen, Elizabeth, and Libby to the front of the ice castle found in the deepest area of the blooming jade stage. It was only a few days ago when the three were blocked in front of the castle. Now, they had the giant to carry them. At this point, the castle was empty and all the 5 element slaves that once guarded it retreated to stage 31 of the other shore. It was a ghost town here. Chapter 3350, Arrangement. You can go to stage 31 of the other shore through the star rings in the ice castle, but the star rings have been provided for the creatures from the chaos. I don't know if you can pass through one, Zen said to the bald giant. Each star ring corresponded to a race. Only members of a race could ascend from their star ring. It was unlikely that the Colossus race had an exclusive star ring. The members of the element spirit race had probably used some other means to bring the bald giant to where he was at the moment. In addition to this, the bald giant was also facing another problem. He had become the ruler of the blooming jade stage. According to the rules of the other shore, once he became a stage ruler, he would forever be bound to this stage of the other shore. Elvinia and Zen had become stage rulers in succession, but they had not become bound to their respective stages of the other shore. This confused Zen, who wondered if the bald giant would be accorded such treatment. The bald giant nodded and took a step forward. He lifted the roof of the ice castle into the air, revealing the star rings neatly placed within. He grabbed at the star rings, spilling them all over the ice. These things are so small. How can I get into them? The bald giant said, frowning. Just step into a star ring, said Zen. The star ring was similar to a transmission door. No matter how large an individual was, a star ring could accommodate them. Even the star rings for races with huge figures, such as the Abyss Spirit race, were about the same size as that for humans. The bald giant stared at a star ring before taking a deep breath and then stepping forward into it. Buzz! The star ring sucked him in with a whoosh, emitting white light as it did. He seems to be going through the star ring for the ear-mouse race. Is it possible? Libby asked, worried. Zen shrugged and said, I don't know. He has to try it himself. Zen had communicated a lot with the bald giant on their way here. He had established a certain friendship with the giant after multiple rounds of battle. They had more to talk about with each other now, and the primeval Lord of Heaven also took the opportunity to tell Zen to ask him some questions. The bald giant was called Pompeo, a name that had a far more complicated pronunciation than it looked. To the disappointment of the primeval Lord of Heaven, the Colossus race seemed to be a primitive race. Pompeo could read a few Sanskrit words, but he didn't know a lot about the abstruse energy world. He only knew that the Colossus race controlled 10 mountains, each of which was vast and boundless. He lived at the top of one of the mountains all year round and fell to the other shore when he went hunting one day. He had no idea about the other races and their geography and culture in the abstruse energy world. He had a vast knowledge about hunting skills and all kinds of beasts in the mountain. Zen had seen these beasts, which were the monsters that were also imprisoned in the cold prisons. At these answers, Zen and the primeval Lord of Heaven looked disappointed. At this point, they only knew that the area outside stage 33 of the other shore was mountainous and that was where Pompeo's clansmen lived. They knew nothing else. But when Zen began to inquire about the colorful starry rockfish, Pompeo looked at him with a newfound respect. He told Zen that the starry rockfish was a sacred beast of the Colossus race. Whenever the sacred beast appeared, no matter what the clansmen were doing, the priest of the Colossus race would lead all of them to kneel down before it. This sacred beast had, however, never descended. It only floated back and forth in the sky. It was easy for a primitive race to form a faith. According to the primeval Lord of Heaven's judgment, the members of the Colossus race might not have any inner connection with the starry rockfish. But for some reason, the starry rockfish had been circling in the sky of the Three Purities stage and flying over the 10 mountains. This had resulted in the members of the Colossus race taking it as their faith. This was all that Zen had heard from Pompeo. The star ring for the ear-mouse race suddenly began to tremble violently, and it spat out a ray of white light. Pompeo's body came flying out of the star ring and smashed into the surface of the ice not far from them, tumbling in several circles before he came to a stop and got to his feet. He failed. Libby's and Elizabeth's eyes flashed. They had both anticipated this result. It would have been incredible if he had ascended from the star ring for the ear-mouse race. I couldn't ascend, said Pompeo, touching his bald head. Zen smiled and said, try another star ring. Taking Zen's advice, Pompeo stepped into another star ring. It wasn't long before he was thrown out again. It was not until he had tried several star rings in succession and failed every single time that Zen sighed and said, it looks like we'll have to use some other means to send you up. What other means? Pompeo asked helplessly. He had always wanted to return to his race and was unwilling to stay on the other shore any longer. We'll have to find some means from the element spirit race, said Zen. I can't go to the three purities stage, said Pompeo anxiously. But I can. I will help you find a way to step into the three purities stage, Zen said. Pompeo looked grateful at this. What can I do? He asked. Help us control the blooming jade stage and suppress the element spirit race, Zen said. Because of Pompeo's actions, the element spirit race had chosen to temporarily retreat. Except for the 5 element slaves that Pompeo had killed, the remaining members of the element spirit race had all retreated to stage 31 of the other shore. Although all the ice castles in the blooming jade stage had been swept away, there was no doubt that the element spirit race would make a comeback once Pompeo left. But if Pompeo were to stay here, he would be able to help the humans gradually take control of the blooming jade stage. Zen had come up with this idea before, but he wouldn't keep Pompeo here if he could ascend. Now that Pompeo couldn't leave by himself, Zen had to make good use of this situation. In return, he would help him find a way to ascend to the upper stages. Pompeo blinked his huge eyes and nodded, agreeing with Zen's suggestion. The Colossus race was a primitive race, but Pompeo was not stupid. He knew that Zen would not help him for no reason. He himself had helped Zen because they had the same enemy and they could make use of each other. Elizabeth, would you like to stay in the blooming jade stage to assist Pompeo? Zen turned to ask Elizabeth. By asking Elizabeth to assist Pompeo, he intended for Elizabeth to take charge instead since Pompeo would be fighting most of the time. Elizabeth didn't refuse, but she was hesitant as she said, but I can't communicate with him. Now, the only person who could communicate with Pompeo was Zen. It doesn't matter, I'll talk to him about everything in advance. He'll follow your orders, Zen said. Pompeo needed to kill all the members of the element spirit race who entered the blooming jade stage, or anyone that Elizabeth considered a threat. She only needed to give simple orders for him to do her bidding. Chapter 3351, Bone Cave. Zen spoke with Pompeo a while longer and asked him to cooperate with Elizabeth. Pompeo wanted to return to his hometown and so demonstrated absolute willingness to do whatever was needed of him. Now that this problem was solved, Zen and Libby decided to head for stage 31. Before they took their leave, Elizabeth stopped them. Wait a moment. What's the matter? Zen asked with curiosity, turning to look at Elizabeth. The land of bone tribulation is way more dangerous than the Soul City. I can't go with you, but just, be careful, Elizabeth said tenderly. Her original plan was to escort Zen all the way to stage 32, after sneaking through the blooming jade stage. He was inexperienced and having Elizabeth at his side would certainly help him in avoiding many dangers. However, she had never expected her plan to have such a huge flaw. As a result, she would actually have to stay in charge of the entire blooming jade stage. The sudden change of the situation was difficult for her to adapt to and left her feeling somewhat overwhelmed. Don't worry about me, you still need to worry about the element spirit race's retaliation. They won't let you off easily, Zen warned. With Pompeo's strength, he could defeat every enemy in stage 30, but who knew what strange methods the element spirit race would use against him. Zen and Libby then walked straight through the star ring of the human race. As they crossed the threshold, they transformed into 2 rays of white light and shot upwards to the higher stage. The Sanskrit light stage, stage 31 of the other shore, was said to be the most mysterious of them all. Zen opened his eyes once they had entered the Sanskrit light stage and saw nothing but blank whiteness. He was soon surprised to discover he was in a narrow cave that was white in every direction he looked. It was certainly strange on the eyes, and there appeared to be a special aura around as well. An aura familiar to Zen. It reminded him of the bottom of the chaos. This feeling he got now was very similar to the aura in the prison created by the chaos ancient god. What is this cave? Zen asked, looking around and taking a few steps forward. It's no ordinary cave. This is a bone cave, answered Libby. This might have been her first time here, but she had done her research beforehand and thus knew more about this stage than Zen. In fact, we're inside a very large bone right now. Inside a bone? Zen's astonishment didn't last long. His eyes widened and he looked around again as he soon understood why he sensed the familiar aura of wild bones. Generally speaking, the bones were empty inside. Some gigantic creatures did have large openings within their bones, and these were enough for smaller creatures to move around freely. He walked up to the wall of the cave and reached out to touch it. It felt cool on his palm. It was indeed the touch of bones. It is said that all paths in the entire Sanskrit light stage are formed by similar bone caves to this. The world outside the caves is a deadly forbidden area, similar to the upper ice field in stage 30, Libby said, smiling joyfully. She had once believed quite firmly that the upper ice field was a forbidden area. But then she had followed Zen across it twice. It was inconceivable. She now thought that no so-called forbidden area existed in the world at all. You mean we will travel through the Sanskrit light stage in these bone caves? How do larger creatures pass through these caves? It seems it would be impossible for them, Zen asked, lost in curiosity. It was no problem for creatures of human size, and even creatures twice the size of a human would still be able to pass through these bone caves, even if only barely. But for enormous creatures like those of the abyss spirit race, if they were to enter a cave of this size in the Sanskrit light stage, they would either stretch the caves dreadfully or get crushed in the narrow space. And it would only be worse for a member of Colossus race. If Pompeo were with them, his life would have come to a grim end. There are larger bone caves for them, Libby explained cheerfully. Elizabeth had been their guide in stage 30 since she was most familiar with the area. Even if Libby knew anything about the places they went, she had virtually no chance to show it. Now that Elizabeth was no longer with them, Libby felt the important mission of guiding Zen fell to her. What? Larger bone caves? Zen exclaimed in shock. A space this large inside a bone is astonishing enough. If there are caves massive enough for the abyss spirit race, how large will those bones actually be? What sort of creatures would have such gigantic bones? Libby shrugged and said, I haven't found any information relevant to that in the documents. She patted the wall of the bone cave and added, I don't know what kind of creature's bone this is either. Let's go now. Zen nodded and followed her into the depths of the cave. The entire bone cave was dead straight for the around 1,000 feet they advanced. But then, a sharp bend revealed itself before them, with a bulging joint between the two bone caves. Zen looked at the corners of the walls as they made their way through the joint. He hoped to get a glimpse of the forbidden area Libby had mentioned. But the joint had no gaps at all, and he couldn't see anything beyond the walls. This next bone was also 1,000 feet long. Once they had passed through the second bone cave, they came to an open space. It was a huge bone cavity which connected with other bone caves. They entered the bone cavity and Zen glanced around before asking, there is more than one path. Which one should we take? The bone cavity was connected to 4 other bone caves, creating 4 different paths. It appeared the entire Sanskrit light stage was an incredibly large maze. The second one on the left, answered Libby without hesitation. How do you know? Zen asked curiously. From the records of the predecessors. Didn't you try learning about the higher stages before entering the other shore? Libby asked. Knowledge of the higher stages of the other shore was kept confidential to the public, but it was open to the disciples of the Oneness Sky Palace, especially the elites in the land of sword grief. Not only was Libby a genius with extraordinary talent, but she worked hard to learn anything she could as well. She had already done her research about stages to come before entering the Soul City. Zen smiled awkwardly and said, apologies for my carelessness. That's all right. I'll lead the way, Libby said, walking to the front and entering into the second bone cave on the left. They walked along this path a while before coming to another bone cavity. Again, Libby didn't hesitate in choosing the second cave on the left. She then turned to explain to Zen, there's actually more than one correct path leading to the land of bone tribulation. This is the shortest recorded path. As she spoke, they suddenly heard a rustling coming from the depths of the cave ahead of them. The caves were hollow, so even the smallest sound would echo through and travel a long distance. They listened carefully and soon realized there were creatures running towards them. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. Several figures emerged ahead. The one at the front yelled at them, run. Humans, run for your lives. There are ghost claw worms coming. Is that an ear mouse? Zen recognized the voice and then saw the shapes of 5 ear mice clearly. Libby's joy fled at the creature's warning. Oh no, we should run now, she exclaimed. Zen didn't fully understand what was coming, but he could tell that ghost clawworms were formidable enemies from Libby's reaction. He quickly turned and followed her out of the bone cave. Chapter 3352, Getting Involved. They retreated from the cave hurriedly and the ear mice soon followed. For these ear mice to be in the Sanskrit light stage meant they too were powerful warriors of the Holy Soul realm. However, their terror as they fled was clear. Zen realized the ghost claw worms they spoke of should not be underestimated. Whoosh! As the ear mice escaped into the bone cavity, a dark black object suddenly came from behind them. It looked like a snake, but its front end split into three, like a three-fingered ghost claw. Crack! The three fingers of the ghost claw suddenly stretched and slammed down heavily on the head of an ear mouse, its fingertips penetrating right into the poor creature's soul. No! The ear mouse let out a series of desperate screams as it was dragged back into the bone cave. Its distressing squeak could be heard a long while before it finally stopped. This must have meant that the ear mouse had been dragged a great distance away. The other four ear mice could do nothing but watch helplessly as their companion was hauled away. Without missing a beat, they then escaped into another bone cave, swiftly moving on. Zen and Libby followed the four ear mice into the bone cave. Behind them, many black ghost claw worms were swarming over, chasing after them blisteringly fast, so fast it seemed as if they were flying. Zen glanced back as he ran and saw that they were not flying but crawling along the walls of the cave. There were countless tiny feet on the limbs of the ghost claw worms, similar to those of a centipede. Their feet moved fast and flowed like waves, advancing them along the wall at high speed. What are these ghost claw worms? Their heads look like a ghost claw, but their bodies are worms. Zen asked, sounding a little disgusted. I don't know. According to the documents, these creatures come from the outside world, answered Libby while she kept running hard. The outside world? Zen was stunned. These bone caves are not completely closed off. Some parts of the bone joints are broken and creatures from the forbidden area outside break in, Libby revealed. The bone joints Zen had observed were closed tightly, but apparently not all were this way. This gave the other shore creatures outside the bone caves a chance to invade. Stage 29 and Stage 31 were chock full of dangers. The element spirit race couldn't establish a gathering spot on the two stages, which was why they attached great importance to the blooming jade stage. Swish! The ghost claw worms were fast and relentless, quickly closing the distance between them. If this continued, sooner or later they'd be devoured. Zen, take the first path on the left. Libby shouted as they got close to the next bone cavity coming up ahead. She had never imagined they'd encounter such dangers when they had just entered the Sanskrit light stage. They rushed into the bone cavity and Zen and Libby made a sharp turn, taking them into the first bone cave on the left. The ear mice, however, rushed into a cave in the middle. Then something unexpected happened. The black ghost claw worms didn't follow behind them, they ignored them completely. They seemed focused on targeting the ear mice and only chasing them down as fiercely as they had been. Well, Zen stopped at the entrance of the cave. They seemed to be set on the ear mice. It's possible, but we still have to keep our guard up, said Libby vigilantly. The black slender bodies of the worms wriggled past in front of Zen and Libby. Their bodies seemed to be infinitely long, long enough for them to hunt down and swallow every life form in the Sanskrit light stage. No, it wasn't long before the miserable screams of another ear mouse came from the next cave as it was dragged away horribly. If we cut off their bodies, will they die? Zen asked, excited by his idea. It was very hard for a superforce to have a holy soul realm master, so it would be a great tragedy to lose a master at the said realm. The ear mouse race had always been on good terms with Zen, so he didn't have the heart to see them die right before him. But Libby shook her head furiously at Zen's suggestion. No. Please don't do that. Libby had much less experience than Elizabeth in dealing with crises. All she knew was the documents contained warnings to never provoke any living being in the Sanskrit light stage. Just like the Garudas in stage 29, they also lacked in power to combat the creatures in this stage. Similarly, she believed that the best course of action was to avoid the ghost claw worms and so didn't want Zen to meddle. She hoped the worms would simply leave after capturing all the ear mice. Unfortunately, things didn't go according to plan. The remaining 3 ear mice fled along the bone caves, circling all the way around and coming out the other side of the cave Zen and Libby were in. Oh no! Despair washed over the ear mice's faces as they saw the long bodies of the ghost claw worms behind Zen and Libby. The heads of the ghost claw worms were hot on their heels, while their long bodies blocked the opposite end leading out. The cave they had escaped into had obviously turned out to be a dead end. These guys, Libby sighed, exasperated at the ear mice coming back at them. She had expected them to draw the ghost claw worms away. Yet they brought disaster back their way and took her and Zen back into the middle of a predicament. Zen gazed cautiously at the ferocious heads of the worms and asked Libby, "Do you have any other shore weapons with you?" His physical body couldn't have a Sumeru space on the other shore, so all the weapons and treasures he had collected in stage 14 were left in Elvinia's care. Yes, Libby answered. She flicked her hand and a flash of blue light sparked from her Sumeru space and a golden longsword appeared in her hand. It was made of the sort of rare ores she had dug up in stage 25, and it was one of her favorites. Zen took the longsword from her and strode out of the bone cave. Buzz. As the incredible power of the civilization artifact surged into his body, he slashed the sword forward. A beam of sword radiance containing tens of thousands of divine megatons of force gathered and shot out. Puff. The bodies of the ghost clawworms were sliced like a bundle of hemp rope and left an opening for them to escape through. The heads of the ghost clawworms behind the ear mice all hissed in pain. Even when their bodies were cut, their heads remained alive and even quickened their speed. Zen did not care what was happening behind him. He rushed forward with Libby, and the 3 ear mice followed closely behind them. Human friend, thank you very much. Thank you for saving our lives. My friend, you are on the other shore in your physical form. Are you Zen Luo from the Oneness Sky Palace? When the ear mice saw Zen offering his hand, they all made up their minds to follow closely behind him. In their eyes, he was the last life-saving straw they had. They were able to identify Zen quickly by his special form, as it was famous on the other shore. What did you do to provoke these ghost claw worms? Why do they keep chasing you like this? Libby asked, annoyed and impatient, before Zen could even answer their question. They had just reached the Sanskrit light stage and were now stuck being chased incessantly by these worms. It was all the ear mice's fault and she made her indignation obvious to them. Chapter 3353, The Bottom of the Sea. Squeak. There's something wrong with the whole Sanskrit light stage. The ear mouse in the lead said. This ear mouse was called Fidel. It was one of the 19 elders of the ear mouse race and held a high position in the race. Why is there something wrong with the Sanskrit light stage? What's the problem? Zen asked with a frown. Zen had passed through the Soul City quite smoothly. He had expected passing through the land of bone tribulation to not be difficult either. But it didn't look easy. Many bone caves have been damaged. A number of things have come in. Fidel squeaked, horrified. It was obvious that the ghost clawworms had not been the only ones to drill into the bone caves from the outside. You can leave the other shore, but why do you still choose to run like this? Libby asked. The monsters outside the bone caves weren't like the element spirit race which stayed in the ice city. If they had no way out, they would recite the illusion breaking rune and retreat. Libby didn't want to help the ear mice, but she also didn't stop Zen when she noticed that he wanted to help them. If they really couldn't find a way out, the worst that would happen was that she and Zen would temporarily have to leave the other shore. But even though the ear mice kept being chased by those monsters, they still did not retreat from the other shore. There had to be a reason for this. Can't you see our feet? Fidel squeaked. Zen and Libby looked down to see that the footsteps of the ear mice were flashing with the pale blue light. Soul interdicting water. Zen's gaze froze. Do the other shore creatures of the Sanskrit light stage know how to use this thing? I think. Libby was about to answer Zen's question, but Fidel interrupted her and said, Zen, don't you have a good understanding of the Sanskrit light stage before entering it? Today was the second time that he had been asked such a question and Zen's face flamed in embarrassment. Not really. The entire Sanskrit light stage is soaked in the soul interdicting water. The soul binding thread, the soul interdicting water, and the soul restraining sand on the other shore are produced here, replied Fidel. The soul interdicting water in the Sanskrit light stage brought about many experiments among the super forces. After collecting the soul interdicting water, one needed to steam it with fire to remove all the impurities within it and obtain the purest soul restraining sand. If one processed the soul restraining sand again, they could get the soul binding thread which was more difficult to get rid of. The Sanskrit light stage not only had the land of bone tribulation, but was also considered to be a place rich in mineral resources. The mine here, however, would just be regarded as a tool for the other shore realm warriors of the chaos to kill each other. These bones are soaked in the soul interdicting water. Zen exclaimed, astonished. It's common sense. I thought you knew it, Libby said, shrugging. There had once been a small number of people who had been to the forbidden area outside the bone caves and seen the soul interdicting water as an ocean. A large portion of bones were soaked in the sea, while the rest of bones remained above sea level. Zen and Libby were at the bottom of these bones when they ascended from the blooming jade stage, which meant that they were actually at the bottom of the sea. Strange creatures like the ghost claw worms lived in the soul interdicting water all year round and were clear about what their prey constituted. They would first attack creatures that were tainted with the soul interdicting water. So they had taken to ignoring Zen and Libby during the previous pursuit. Even though Zen had cut off their bodies, the ghost claw worms didn't have any intention of attacking Zen and Libby. They weren't intelligent and only kept chasing the ear mice all the time. Whoosh! 4 ghost clawworms sped up along the wall of the cave. The 3 fingers on their heads opened up, clamoring to grab the ear mice. Squeak, squeak. The 3 ear mice didn't give up and kept trying to escape the attacks of the ghost clawworms. They were, after all, at the Holy Soul realm. Their souls were no weaker than ordinary physical bodies. Fidel's body pressed against the ground as it rushed up along the circular wall of the cave, and managed to avoid the attack. The other 2 ear mice also used the same method to display their agility. But the ghost clawworms were faster. One of the ghost clawworms raised its 3-fingered claw and grabbed one of the ear mice by the head, intending to drag it backwards. The ear mouse squeaked and struggled in anguish. Whoosh! A sudden ray of sword light flashed at the ghost clawworm's head, which was also its hand, and cut through it. A mouth appeared in the palm of the ghost clawworm's broken hand, and it let out a painful scream. The 3 fingers released the ear mouse, as the ghost clawworm rolled back and forth on the ground in pain. Once the ear mouse broke free from the ghost clawworm's grip, it recovered quickly and hurried to follow Fidel. This will be easy to deal with, especially since these ghost clawworms are demon bent on attacking only you, said Zen. The ghost clawworms were not invulnerable to blades and spears. They only moved fast, were large in number, and were very aggressive. But killing them wasn't difficult, especially with Zen's current strength. Squeak, squeak, indeed, thank you, Zen, squeak, squeak. Fidel and the other ear mice were overjoyed. The ghost clawworms had chased them for a long time, and several of their members had died as a result of this. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Several more ghost clawworms sped up and rushed over to them. Zen raised his head, his gaze narrowing. The long sword in his hand had already started to emit specks of starlight. Puff, puff, puff. After several consecutive sword strikes, Zen stabbed at the wrists of the ghost clawworms, which were also their necks. The beheaded ghost clawworms fell to the ground one after another, wailing and rolling on the ground. They were no longer able to chase the ear mice. After he had figured out how to deal with the ghost clawworms, Zen found that it was easy to handle them. There were a large number of ghost clawworms behind him. But as long as there were worms that dared to stretch their heads out, Zen would use his long sword to chop, stab and behead them. In 5 minutes, Zen had killed more than 30 ghost clawworms. An hour later, there were only a few ghost clawworms scattered on the wall. Zen stopped and waved his long sword towards the sky. An arc-shaped sword light shot out of the sword and cut off the heads of the ghost clawworms. They were now all struggling on the ground. The ear mice stopped running and breathed a collective sigh of relief when the ghost clawworms were finally killed. We got rid of them. Zen, we would have died if it weren't for you. What a coincidence. You saved my son in the chaotic source world before. You hadn't stepped into the desire world at the time. I haven't expected you to reach the Sanskrit light stage and save my life, one of the ear mice exclaimed. The 3 ear mice were expressing their gratitude when Libby suddenly asked, but where are we now? At her question, the ear mice began to panic. Caught up in the chase that the ghost clawworms had given them, they had no idea which bone cave they were in now. Chapter 3354, Outside. Libby's question made Zen and the 3 ear mice realize this was a problem that needed to be addressed. The bone caves in the Sanskrit light stage formed the most complicated maze any of them had ever come across. Up until now, there was still no one who had completely worked out the entire maze. Deviating too far from our original route would be disastrous, I'm afraid, Fidel said seriously. Zen considered their options for a while before finally saying, those ghost clawworms always leave traces, and we can go back the same way we came by following those traces they've left. After that, he turned and began walking back. Zen had sliced the ghost clawworms' heads off at the neck and they still struggled on the ground. Even now they still stretched out 3 fingers in an attempt to grab Zen as he passed. Whoosh! The long sword in Zen's hand shook, and with a flash of sword radiance, he had cut the wriggling heads in halves. Zen and the ear mice felt more comfortable with their plan after seeing these ghost clawworms. Zen had killed many along the way, so it'd be an easy trail to follow back. They followed the corpses, walking the wrong way on several occasions before they had finally found the original path they had taken here. The ear mice had come from a different bone cave and recorded a different path. Now they too, like Zen, were counting on Libby to lead the way. Fortunately, although it was Libby's first time in the Sanskrit light stage, she was very smart and remembered the way to the land of bone tribulation clearly. There are 8 bone caves in the bone cavity. We should take the 7th one. There are 2 roads here. We should take the left one. The first bone cave. Under her guidance, they continued onward, slightly uphill. Just as Fidel had said, they were in fact still in the sea formed by the soul-interdicting water. If they broke through a wall of a bone cave, the soul-interdicting water would gush in. But many bones were in the water, looking like countless tubes. The route the ear mice had taken had been submerged by the soul-interdicting water, but everything was fine for the one the human race had recorded in their documents, and they continued smoothly along the way. The size of the Sanskrit light stage was no smaller than that of the blooming jade stage. Zen and his companions climbed up the bone caves for 4 hours before they finally came to a huge bone cavity. There were many bone caves of different sizes here. The largest was massive and the smallest was only as big as a fist. Zen looked around and said, "It seems that all the bone caves are connected to this bone cavity." "Yes, this one is our ear mice's bone cave," said Fidel, pointing at a cave that was neither too big nor too small. "That is the bone cave of the separate abyss race." Fidel shrieked as it pointed at a wide bone cave. It was so large that even those of the separate abyss race could walk through it freely. This was indeed their bone cave. But there was something odd about it. A green light flashed at the entrance of the cave as if reflected by a mirror. It soon discovered that the entire cave had been filled with soul-interdicting water. "What's wrong?" Zen and Libby had noticed Fidel's strange reaction immediately. They walked over to have a closer look and were both shocked at what they saw. "Whose bone cave is this?" Zen asked. "The separate abyss race," exclaimed Fidel. "It seems that the separate abyss race have it much worse. Their cave is filled with the soul-interdicting water. I wonder if there's anyone trapped within it," Zen mused, shaking his head. As Zen climbed higher up the stages of the other shore, the number of souls of light he could meet lowered. There was only the land of bone tribulation on the huge Sanskrit light stage where warriors could explore. A warrior like Libby, who had reached the Holy Soul realm, would usually choose to pass through the Sanskrit light stage and go directly to stage 32, the destination of the powerful Holy Souls. Splash! As they looked on, the soul-interdicting water had risen by a foot. When it eventually overflowed, it would probably pour into the other bone caves around it. "Let's go. The bone cave is full of soul-interdicting water. Who knows what monsters might burst from it," Libby urged, standing aside. Zen nodded in agreement and looked up at the other end of the bone cavity. "I wonder which bone cave leads to the land of bone tribulation." There were many bone caves of various sizes around the huge cavity, but in the center were 3 bone caves that extended up diagonally. It was Zen's first time here, but he understood enough to know that the exit of the Sanskrit light stage was among these 3 caves. "Zen, are you heading to the land of bone tribulation?" Fidel asked excitedly. Since ancient times, no one in the chaos had been able to enter the land of bone tribulation. Over the years, only a small number of other shore creatures had gone there, but no one in the chaos had the necessary qualifications to enter. "Yes," Zen nodded. "We'll be taking the cave in the middle to go to stage 32. To get to the land of bone tribulation, you should go through the cave on the left." Fidel said enviously, "If you succeed, you'll be the first to qualify to enter the eternal scroll painting after ancient times." This was important news to the ear mice, and when Fidel could leave the other shore, it would surely bring it to the superiors immediately. Libby looked at Zen in silence. She knew the left bone cave led to the land of bone tribulation, but because she couldn't go there herself, she knew little of it and could not offer Zen any advice. Zen glanced at her and said, "Since you can't come with me and the ear mice are going to stage 32, you should go with them." "I'll wait for you here," said Libby. "It's too dangerous here," Fidel yelled in warning. "Normally, you staying here wouldn't be a problem. But Fidel is right, the soul-interdicting water has begun flooding and who knows what followed the water in," Zen pointed out, shaking his head as he spoke. The ghost clawworms alone were tough to deal with, not to mention there could be more than one kind of creature in the soul-interdicting water. Libby considered this a while and decided Zen made a lot of sense, and so she agreed. Zen then jumped up straight to the first bone cave on the left and climbed up along the wall. It was over 10,000 feet long and very wide. He could still hear the echo of his footsteps when he walked. When he was halfway up, a black fog appeared around the cave. This gave him pause and he hesitated. But then, the primeval Lord of Heaven, who had been observing Zen this whole time, reminded him, "Don't worry. This black fog is only to scare off souls and can't harm a physical body." Holy souls were forbidden to step on this road, naturally there were some measures to stop them. These words of comfort swept Zen's worries away and he continued climbing up. He was almost at the top when a ray of light shone in front of him, lighting the dim cave. "Does this bone cave lead outside?" Zen's eyes glinted and he quickened his pace. When he finally reached the top, He saw what it was like outside the bone cave. He saw a boundless blue sea and slender bones in the water upside down, sticking out like bamboo growing in the sea. This was the forbidden area outside the bone caves that Libby had mentioned. Chapter 3355, Bone Slaves. Once he was out of the bone cave, Zen saw a sprawling white beach in front of him. He bent down to grab the white sand and watched it fall in between his fingers. This sand is also bones. Were countless bones truly crushed and gathered here? Ordinary crushed bones would have already been weathered. These bones were originally this small, the primeval Lord of Heaven answered. Hearing this, Zen lifted the sand on his palm and looked at it more carefully. As the primeval Lord of Heaven said, these bones were indeed whole and were just incredibly small. For such bones to be so small that they ended up covering an entire area and be mistaken for sand was both incredible and unsettling. Are these from the tiny creatures of the calculation civilization? Zen asked. The green figure on the civilization artifact shook its head. It's not us. We're even way smaller than these bones. Too many civilizations and creatures had existed in the chaos. Over 1,000 races had once become ruling civilizations, and those underneath them were even more numerous. Of course, there would always be creatures bigger or smaller than others. If you walk a bit more, you'll come upon some new discoveries, the primeval Lord of Heaven said. Zen decided to walk further along the beach and, to his surprise, found the bones that littered the ground progressively get larger. At first, it had been the size of a grain of sand until it became the size of a pea, then the size of a fist. This somehow reminded him of the immemorial wilderness, save for the fact that the bones there were randomly placed. Here on the beach, the bones were arranged in a certain orderly manner. As he ventured forward, Zen began to see more familiar bones, specifically, human bones. He bent down and picked up a random arm bone. The bone beach records all creatures on the other shore. Yes, the primeval Lord of Heaven confirmed. Zen turned the bone in his hand curiously. What about the regal jade civilization? He asked. Some civilizations had special forms, and the regal jade civilization was one of them, since they did not have any bones. Look at the front left, the regal jade spirit suddenly said, with a smile on his face. The regal jade spirit had also stepped into the land of bone tribulation before, so he knew some things. Zen did as he said. When he looked to the left, he saw various green fragments in between the bones. Beside these fragments were metal bones from the metal civilization. Entering the soul city allows one's soul to complete a transformation, while entering the land of bone tribulation allows one's body to undergo change. The degree of transformation of soul and body directly determines the power you will obtain in the eternal scroll painting, the primeval Lord of Heaven explained. Eternal warriors at the eternal realm were the most powerful existence in this world. However, the eternal scroll painting also had a ranking system, and the higher one's ranking was, the greater power one would obtain. Zen raised his eyebrows with interest. The eternal scroll painting? The primeval Lord of Heaven nodded. Yes, you've gotten 9 holy soul imprints, he began. You are the #1 person in history, and just by relying on these 9 holy soul imprints, your ranking in the eternal scroll painting won't be low. However, if you can obtain 9 bone tribulation imprints, then your ranking could naturally go higher. In fact, the primeval Lord of Heaven already spoke to the elites of the human race about this. All of them had high expectations for Zen. The more imprints, the higher the ranking. Zen surmised. It hadn't been that hard to figure out. Most cases go like that, though there are exceptions, the primeval Lord of Heaven said. My junior fellow disciple obtained 16 imprints, but the ranking he received hadn't been ideal. The one who ranked first only had 14 imprints. More imprints meant a bigger advantage in the eternal scroll painting, but it wasn't the end-all and be-all of everything. There were always creatures with astonishing willpower that could create miracles and defeat those far stronger than them. This piqued Zen's interest. Then, who is it? He asked. A trace of caution appeared on the primeval Lord of Heaven's face. It's the ice spirit of the element spirit race. There weren't many creatures that could make the primeval Lord of Heaven so cautious, but the ice spirit was one of them. Ice spirit, Zen repeated. Is it the strongest warrior of the element spirit race? The primeval Lord of Heaven nodded grimly. Yes, that was the only answer Zen needed, and he stopped asking about the subject. After passing through the land of bone tribulation, he would enter stage 32 and then get into the eternal scroll painting. Now though, he had to focus on getting through this beach of bones first. After he passed by the human bones, the following bones all got bigger and bigger. Now, there were bones several dozen feet, further on they would get bigger until they were several hundred feet, and so on. Only a small part of these huge bones floated above the sea, leaving the rest under the waters. Not long after, Zen finally arrived at the edge of the beach. Any further and he would be in the ocean of soul-interdicting water. It's the end. Where is the land of bone tribulation? He asked. Wait, there should be bone slaves coming, the primeval Lord of Heaven told him. Zen did as he was told and took a seat on one of the huge bones to wait. In the distance, dark green flames suddenly blazed to life. Ghost fire, Zen thought to himself. The cemetery was a place to bury bones and phosphorescent flames frequently rose due to the sheer amount of remains buried there. It was just a bit surprising that there would be flames that burned, though it was the daytime here. As the flames rose, they floated towards the skulls that then gained sentience and began to look for the rest of their bodies. Spine, shoulder blade, ribs. A short while later, fully formed and assembled human skeletons began to walk towards Zen. Are they the bone slaves you were talking about earlier? Zen asked. The primeval Lord of Heaven nodded with a smile. Yes, every race will have their own bone slaves. Zen nodded in understanding, but a question suddenly popped in his head. What if a certain race enters this place for the first time? Before they enter, the bones of their race will have been created and placed here, the primeval Lord of Heaven explained patiently. There were some special powers on the other shore. It should also be noted that the Soul City and the land of bone tribulation were constructed by the instant civilization and were thus naturally different from other places. Zen raised yet another question. These bones, they were created out of nowhere then? The primeval Lord of Heaven smiled, associating Zen's question with the truth of three-energy construction. It is indeed possible. Zia discovered the truth of three-energy construction outside the chaos, which meant the instant civilization also came from there. The reanimated skeletons came straight to Zen and the first skeleton that passed him by flipped a slightly larger bone. Zen watched as the bone landed on the surface of the soul-interdicting water and transformed itself into a boat. Please get on, the skeleton said in a strange voice and gestured invitingly towards the boat. A trace of vigilance appeared on Zen's face as he asked the primeval Lord of Heaven's opinion in his mind. If you want to go to the land of bone tribulation, then you naturally have to board this boat, the primeval Lord of Heaven said, assuring Zen and comforting his nerves. With no more reservations, Zen jumped and landed in the middle of the boat. The other skeletons quickly got to work, scouring the ground for bones to be used as paddles and also getting on the boat. Chapter 3356, Bone Island. The white bone boat floated on the blue ocean. It was rowed manually by the bone slaves, so it did not move too fast. Zen possessed the ability to fly and could do so across the ocean, or even help the bone slaves speed up if he wished. But the primeval Lord of Heaven warned him not to break the rules of the land of bone tribulation. They had entered the land in this way before. As per the advice he was given, Zen just watched on as the bone slaves paddled the boat forward slowly. Their intelligence was at the most basic level, and although they were able to communicate smoothly with Zen, they seemed to know very little. When he asked of theirs and the land of bone tribulation's origin, all they offered was dull, stiff answers. After asking a few more questions, Zen gave up this pursuit with them. Splash, splash, splash. The boat continued on slowly, bypassing bones jutting out of the sea one by one, before Zen finally caught sight of a white island. The island was made of thick bones piling up together and in the center was a huge skull, but Zen didn't know what creature it belonged to. Is this the land of bone tribulation? Zen asked. Yes, a bone slave nodded. As the boat slowly approached the shore, Zen leapt casually into the air and landed on the island. He stood firm when suddenly, a handful of seawater splashed at his head. Being on the other shore for so long, Zen was very alert to soul-interdicting water and the like. The thunder wings on his back exploded violently as his body turned away, barely avoiding the soul-interdicting water. He stabilized in midair and now saw clearly that there were more than a dozen creatures on both sides of the island. They were of many different shapes and sizes, some were tiny, some were as big and burly as giants. But it was obvious they were other shore creatures. Hasn't it been a long time since anyone entered the land of bone tribulation? Zen asked in confusion. He thought he was the only one here. Seeing so many other shore creatures appear all of a sudden was certainly unexpected. Creatures in the chaos can't enter the land of bone tribulation, but the other shore creatures can, the primeval Lord of Heaven revealed to Zen. As long as they were not stage rulers who were bound to a certain stage, the creatures of the other shore were also capable of becoming stronger, gaining the Holy Soul, receiving the training in the land of bone tribulation and entering the eternal scroll painting to get to stage 33. It's that human brat. Human, don't you know the rules? Those from outside the other shore must be tainted with the soul-interdicting water before they can land. Yes, it's a rule. We'll let you down after you bath in the soul-interdicting water. The land of bone tribulation was more difficult to pass through and would take more time than the Soul City. These other shore creatures had been here a long time and had become familiar with each other. Ganging up against outsiders was easy for them. Unfortunately, Zen was quite clearly an outsider. Rules. Who made these rules? Zen asked, narrowing his eyes slightly. No one made them, this has always been the way in the land of bone tribulation, explained another shore creature. Ha ha, Zen laughed coldly. No one in the chaos has been able to enter here after ancient times, and still, after so long, this rule has not been abolished. Or is it that you made it up just now? The soul-interdicting water only had an effect on the creatures outside the other shore. This rule was clearly intended for the creatures in chaos. But it had been quite a long time since any of them stepped into this land. Why did the rule come back just as Zen had appeared? This must be the doing of the element spirit race. Zen's question left the other shore creatures speechless. The only reason why you sprayed the soul-interdicting water on me is to prevent me from escaping, am I right? He asked, slowly descending as the other shore power within the civilization artifact surged crazily in his inner world. Splash! The other shore power erupted and sent his body smashing down towards the island like a meteorite falling from the sky. The other shore creatures had intended to surround Zen, but when they felt the speed at which he had fallen, they all wore stunned expressions and rushed backwards. Boom! Zen slammed into the island. Under the immense power, the entire island began shaking violently and spreading mini tsunamis out over the surrounding sea. Zen looked at the ground in surprise. It too was made of bones, but they were tough far beyond his expectations. There wasn't even a hint of damage to them from his impact. He might not have shattered the bones, but instead shattered the confidence of the other shore creatures. It seemed it was as Zen had guessed. They had indeed received news that a creature from the chaos was on his way, and if they captured him, their races would be rewarded handsomely. They had expected the creature from the chaos would be weak and an easy capture if they took advantage of the soul-interdicting water, as long as he was off guard. They certainly had not expected him to possess such incredible strength. They were stunned silent and lowered their heads like children being reprimanded by their parents. After all, they were not creatures from the chaos and could not leave the other shore. Surrendering was their best option when faced with a far stronger warrior. Does anyone else want to sprinkle the soul-interdicting water on me? Zen asked menacingly as he scanned the creatures around. No one answered. They just looked at Zen with reverence. Zen walked towards a burly creature. He had the head of a bull and a pair of sharp horns. He was from the sturdy bull race residing in stage 27. Seeing Zen heading straight for him, the sturdy bull quickly explained in a panic, he told us the news. He came here and told us that if we attacked you, the element spirit race would reward us, which would benefit our race. The sturdy bull pointed at a cat-like creature not far off. The cat-like creature took 2 steps back when he was pointed out. His eyes narrowed and gazed dangerously, ready to deal with Zen's attack at any moment. But Zen just glanced at him indifferently and said, I came here to pass the land of bone tribulation. As for the grudge between me and the element spirit race, you'd better stay out of it. These other shore creatures were also outstanding warriors of their different races. They had thought Zen was a weak lamb they could bully, and naturally they wanted to rush forward to capture him. But Zen displayed such great power that they decided it was better to not risk their lives. Yes, I'm not a member of the element spirit race, the sturdy bull nodded. They immediately let out a sigh of relief and all the tension in the atmosphere relaxed when Zen showed restrained hostility. Zen looked into the depths of the island and asked, has the land of bone tribulation opened yet? On the bone boat, the primeval Lord of Heaven had told him the basics rules of the land of bone tribulation. Like the Soul City, the land of bone tribulation also opened for a period of time and then closed for another period of time. But the periods were much longer than that of the Soul City. Chapter 3357, Myriad Tribulations Storm. The skull that occupied 3/4 of the island was in fact the entrance to the land of bone tribulation. The land of bone tribulation opens every 800 hours. 640 hours have now passed, the sturdy bull replied. So it will open in 7 days? Asked Zen. Yes, the sturdy bull answered. 7 days. Zen pondered this a while and decided not to leave the other shore. These other shore creatures were not reliable. If he left, there was no guarantee they wouldn't set up a raise and wait for an opportunity to strike at him. He sat down cross-legged facing the skull, dead still in meditation, waiting for its opening. The other shore creatures stood behind him, sizing him up silently. They didn't want to provoke him anymore and so waited with him. 7 days passed by quickly. Once it had been 800 hours, the huge skull trembled and began rising slowly. Zen sensed the change and opened his eyes, staring intently at the rising skull before him. He now realized it was a complete skull, but the lower end of it had been buried in the island before. As it continued to rise, more and more was revealed and a cervical spine now became visible. It turned out to be a complete skeleton. Crack, crack, crack. Once the skull had risen a fair bit, a strange sound echoed from between its jaws. Its mouth slowly opened, releasing, incredibly, a pathway. The other shore creatures itched to give it a go. When the land of bone tribulation had opened before, they would swarm in. But this time, as Zen stood at the front, none of them dared to move first. Zen walked without hesitation, straight into the large mouth of the skull. The other shore creatures followed in as soon as he entered. Inside the skull were stairs made of thin bones. After walking down the bone stairs, they returned to the bottom of the sea. Then another wondrous scene was revealed to them. The soul interdicting water with dark blue light was blocked by an invisible force, forming isolation walls. In the center were many floating white bone plates. This was Zen's first time entering, so he stood on the stairs and looked at the bone plates carefully. The other shore creatures behind him dared not to force him further, so all they could do was wait silently. Zen watched the plates for a full 5 minutes before they could not wait any longer. After all, time was precious when the land of bone tribulation opened. Human friend, you should sit on the white bone plate first to enter the land of bone tribulation, the sturdy bull said from behind. Zen smiled faintly, sensing the angst among these creatures. He jumped down from the stairs and landed on one of the bone plates. Whoosh! The moment he set foot on it, the bone plate carried him to the side. The other creatures jumped onto the bone plates too and sat down, also retreating to the side. Once they all sat on bone plates, identical bone plates appeared on the opposite side with skeletons placed on them. On the plate opposite to the sturdy bull, was a huge skeleton similar to him. On the plate opposite to Zen, was a human skeleton, the same size as he was, making the same moves he did. Zen raised his hand and so did the opposing skeleton. Zen turned his head, and so did the skeleton. It seemed to be a mirror image, but with no flesh and blood. It was just a pale white human skeleton. Is this my tribulation skeleton? Zen asked, staring at the skeleton. In the land of bone tribulation, everyone had their own corresponding tribulation skeletons. When they accepted the test of the land, their tribulation skeletons would in turn undergo a significant change. Zen's tribulation skeleton had just been born when he had entered, so it was as white jade. But the huge tribulation skeleton corresponding to the sturdy bull was covered with a faint layer of golden glaze. He had been here for a long time and clearly had gained a lot. However, this was all gained for the tribulation skeleton. Before it merged with him, he had gained nothing on his own body. Although these creatures had been here a long time, they still did not possess the ability to compete with Zen. Your tribulation skeleton is too new, the sturdy bull said with a trace of pride. He looked at his own tribulation skeleton, which shone with golden light, with love glinting in his eyes. He finally had something to be proud of in front of Zen. The other creatures shared the same sentiment. They didn't know what Zen had done to obtain control of that amazing power, but what did that matter? Here, he was still a newcomer. Once they obtained the myriad tribulation's body, their strength would still be able to surpass Zen's. Zen's eyes flashed with mockery as he asked, "How long have you cultivated here?" "I've been here only 7 years. I've reached this level quite fast actually," the sturdy bull admitted confidently. "Yes, Bryce is quite talented, mainly because he has a divine body which is stronger than other creatures, from the moment he was born," said another shore creature. He then pointed to a centipede-shaped creature close by. "That long insect there is even stranger. He has cultivated a unique body refining method. In just a year, he has already entered the 16th layer of the myriad tribulation's storm." The surface of that centipede's tribulation skeleton shone with golden light as well. It was almost a myriad tribulation's body. The centipede had been silent this whole time, lying motionless on his own bone plate. He was focused solely on cultivating the myriad tribulation's body and had no interest whatsoever in other matters. Even when the element spirit race had sent a message to attack Zen, he paid it no mind. As they spoke, an intense pressure overtook the entire space, suddenly expanding and contracting along with the violent rising and falling of the surrounding seawater. A storm had formed in the center. The storm rose and swept out the soul-interdicting water from the surrounding walls. Drops of soul-interdicting water gathered in the center of the storm. Zen was inevitably hit by the soul-interdicting water as he sat on the bone plate. He tried to dodge, but the soul-interdicting water was too dense. He was hit and then gave up trying to dodge it. He had accepted that he was unable to leave the other shore. Buzz. The soul interdicting water was completely submerged in the rising storm, forming a larger blue storm. Is this the myriad tribulation storm? Frowning, Zen looked at the scene unfolding in front of him. At the same time, he felt confused as to whether he should refine his body with the soul interdicting water. When he was still at a loss for what his next move should be, streaks of golden liquid suddenly rose from the bottom of the storm. Feeling the aura of the golden liquid shrank his pupils. Even the primeval Lord of Heaven who was observing in his inner world seemed to remember something, which changed his face in an instant. Chapter 3358, The Tearing Force. The golden liquid's aura was quite similar to that of the descending rings. Not long ago, Fuxi and the snake goddess from the source world personally asked Zen for the golden red chaotic source spirits. When they were used together with the descending rings, they could directly summon anything from the other shore down to the chaos. It was a way equivalent to breaking the restrictions of truth. In fact, the primeval Lord of Heaven also knew that there would be a blue golden storm in the land of bone tribulation. The blue was the soul interdicting water, but so far, no one knew what the golden liquid was. However, it had been a long time since the primeval Lord of Heaven was in the land of bone tribulation, and he had long forgotten about the aura of this golden liquid. That was why he couldn't connect them to the land of bone tribulation at all when he saw Zen's golden red chaotic source spirits before. But now that Zen had entered the land of bone tribulation, he and Zen naturally realized immediately what the golden liquid might be. Primeval Lord of Heaven, why is this golden liquid's aura in this storm the same as the aura of the descending rings? Asked Zen. The primeval Lord of Heaven was lost in thought. There was a somewhat strange connection between the two. The myriad tribulation storm was a great test for warriors who entered it for training, and only those strong-willed enough could pass it. The mixture of the golden liquid and the soul interdicting water could cause a violent stab of pain to anyone it hit. It was so painful that even the primeval Lord of Heaven still clearly remembered how it felt when he experienced it over 1,000 chaotic eras ago. If the golden liquid is the same type of thing as the descending rings, then it is used to summon things from the other shore, while the soul interdicting water works to prevent anything from descending. Zen analyzed. Upon hearing Zen's words, the primeval Lord of Heaven broke free from his train of thought. He suddenly perked up and said, I got it. It turns out that the land of bone tribulation is so ingeniously designed. The instant civilization was smart to make use of the geographical advantages. What geographical advantages? Zen asked curiously. As you said, the soul interdicting water prevents things from descending while the golden liquid works the same as the descending ring, which is used to summon things down. Their functions contrast each other. If they appear at the same time, then the myriad tribulation storm, which could tear almost everything apart, is formed, the primeval Lord of Heaven theorized. Back then, he couldn't figure out why the mixture of the soul interdicting water and the golden liquid could have such an effect. Now, he seemed to have completely understood it. The two types of liquid within the storm were like two hands, one hand extended to the other shore, while the other extended outside the other shore. Naturally, a powerful tearing force was produced. I'll go in first, the centipede declared before he and his bone plate entered the myriad tribulation storm in the center. At the same time, the tribulation skeleton on his opposite side followed suit. It entered the myriad tribulation storm from the other side of the storm. Da, 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 countless drops of blue and gold mixed together and floated inside the myriad tribulation storm. When the droplets hit a body, they exploded and produced numerous strange black cracks. The cracks expanded, then released a powerful tearing force. If the droplets hit a body that wasn't cultivated to perfection, then it would be quickly torn apart. As the centipede continued to advance, the tribulation skeleton on his opposite side also moved towards the center of the myriad tribulation storm. The small water drops in the outermost layer of the myriad tribulation storm were very small and sparsely scattered. About 10 feet deeper inside, however, the small water drops grew bigger and became denser. When viewed from the outside, there was a layer of water drops every 10 feet, and there was a total of 20 layers from the outermost part to the center of the storm. After the centipede was 30 feet deep into the myriad tribulation storm, small rings suddenly appeared on the surface of his body. The rings were tightly locked together and increased the centipede's physical strength. Da, da, da. In turn, the rings blocked all the black cracks the small water drops made on his body. Meanwhile, his tribulation skeleton on the other side experienced the same as well. As a result, the tribulation skeleton glowed a golden light after the storm repeatedly hit his body. The water drops at the outermost layer did not affect the tribulation skeleton at all, so the centipede had no choice but to go deeper into the storm every time the land of bone tribulation opened. As he moved forward with ease, he abruptly stopped in the 16th layer and remained motionless right after. His tribulation skeleton also stopped in the 16th layer on the other side. Of course, all the other shore creatures who saw the centipede move so quickly sported envious looks. It seemed that he can easily withstand 16 layers of the myriad tribulation storm with the help of the tribulation skeleton. I don't know when I can reach the same level. My tribulation skeleton has just entered the 3rd layer. The other shore creatures began to discuss among themselves as they drove their bone plates forward and entered the myriad tribulation storm. Generally speaking, one's tribulation skeleton became stronger after they entered the myriad tribulation storm. It also affected their real body's strength, so it meant that they could advance further after that process. But after one got out of the myriad tribulation storm, their tribulation skeletons and their real bodies were no longer connected. Only after they had truly obtained the myriad tribulation's bodies would their tribulation skeletons and their real bodies finally merge. Once all the other shore creatures had entered, Zen also took control of his bone plate and entered the myriad tribulation storm. Da! A blue golden drop of water hit his right arm first and burst into a black crack. His body slightly trembled. Indeed, the tearing force from that small water drop was powerful. Fortunately, he had absorbed a large amount of body-strengthening jades and his physical body had reached its limit, so he was strong enough to take it. Furthermore, he wasn't afraid of anything because he had the chaotic source spirits to protect his body. Thus, he simply continued to drive the bone plate forward. On the other hand, the other shore creatures in the myriad tribulation storm all looked at him. As for them, they all activated their body-protecting thurgies to defend against the water droplets. Some of them used illusory shield shadows that surrounded their bodies, while some others' bodies glowed with a golden light. While all of them changed in some way, there were no changes in Zen's body at all. Did that guy just withstand the water drops with his physical body? Will he really go to the 2nd layer the first time he has entered the storm? He's so aggressive. Just wait and see, he'll surely suffer. It was known that the water drops were immensely powerful despite their size. It was likely for one to lose their life if they weren't careful in the myriad tribulation storm. Some of the other shore creatures even began to think that if Zen was seriously injured, they wouldn't mind killing him. They became more excited now that the soul interdicting water had tainted Zen, since he would have no way to escape. But just as the crowd thought, Zen had already driven the bone plate 30 feet forward and stepped into the 3rd layer. On the other side, his tribulation skeleton also sat upright on the bone plate. The water droplets continuously hit it, but there were only faint golden marks on its surface. Even though these small water drops have a strong tearing force, it cannot affect my body on a large scale. Warriors at the chaotic source realm are best at resisting such attacks, Zen said in a low voice. The chaotic source spirits feared bearing too much power at once the most. However, the constant tearing of the water droplets hardly exhausted them. Zen looked ahead and the corner of his mouth slightly curled up. Then, he did something that surprised everyone around him. He leaned forward a little, then the bone plate quickly moved forward. In the blink of an eye, he was already 100 feet into the storm and had landed at the side of the warrior from the sturdy bull race. Chapter 3359, Too Slow. The member of the sturdy bull race still focused on resisting the water drops. His muscles flashed with a bronze glow. Every time he activated his bloodline thurgy, his blood vitality became more potent and greatly increased the toughness of his physical body. I need to hold on for 6 hours. He exclaimed. As long as he stayed within the 10th layer for 6 full hours, his tribulation skeleton would surely grow stronger. However, to do so was a huge challenge. After all, to continuously activate the bloodline power consumed a lot of his strength. Fortunately, the current round of myriad tribulation storm had just started. He was still full of energy, so the task was a piece of cake. Just as he sat down and turned around to check how the human newcomer was doing, he suddenly realized that Zen was already at the spot beside him. His eyes widened to the size of saucers. He stared blankly at Zen for a long while before he came back to his senses. How is this possible? He was so shocked as if he had seen a monster and not a human. He couldn't figure out how Zen had reached the spot beside him in such a short period. They were already 100 feet into the myriad tribulation storm at that point, and the water drops in the 10th layer were far more powerful. It was simply impossible, even if one's physical body had absorbed enough body-strengthening jades and had cultivated to its limit. What made it more surprising was that it was Zen's first time to experience such a trial, and his tribulation skeleton hardly even bore any damages. With a steady drip, the water drops kept hitting Zen's body. Black cracks spread all over his skin, but it looked like he wasn't in pain at all. Opposite him on the other side of the myriad tribulation storm, the water droplets had quickly tempered his tribulation skeleton. The closer they got to the center of the storm, the faster the tribulation skeleton would be refined. The refinement speed at the 10th layer was 100 times faster than that in the outermost layer. As the small drops of water poured continuously onto Zen's tribulation skeleton, its golden color became increasingly clear. Then, it glowed brighter while he felt his body become solid and stable as if an invisible power had enhanced it. Is this feeling from my tribulation skeleton? Zen muttered with raised brows. Of course, he was a bit surprised. He was different from the other shore races, like the sturdy bull race. After all, he could withstand the myriad tribulation storm with merely the help of the chaotic source spirits. In fact, had it been ordinary chaotic source realm warriors, it wouldn't be long before the water droplets had exhausted their chaotic source spirits. Thanks to the special truth of godly ways Zen had obtained, his chaotic source spirits recovered quickly after an attack. That was why he could easily survive in the myriad tribulation storm. How did you resist the water drops? The sturdy bull couldn't help but ask curiously. With my physical body, of course, replied Zen. The sturdy bull's face twitched as he was rendered speechless. The sturdy bull race was another shore race that only appeared in recent chaotic eras. They didn't know much about the human race, and most of their curiosity came from the sudden increase of human souls of light on the other shore in later years. However, they still didn't take the human souls of light at the Holy Soul realm seriously. After all, even though the Holy Souls were strong enough to fight against the other shore creatures could still become much stronger if they cultivated a myriad tribulation's body. However, contrary to the rumors, not only did Zen have a physical form, he also had too much power that was beyond what the sturdy bull had imagined. While the member of the sturdy bull race was still in shock, Zen suddenly asked, "It seems that the refinement speed in the 10th layer isn't fast. How long will it take to achieve the same level of your tribulation skeleton?" Zen's dissatisfaction at the refining speed in the 10th layer stunned the sturdy bull once again. He remained quiet for a while before he said, "It will take you at least a couple of months. Every time the land of bone tribulation opened, I held on for 5 hours in the 10th layer. I have spent about a total of 3 months here already. Generally speaking, the time between the openings of the land of bone tribulation was very long. Even if the sturdy bull activated his bloodline power to its limit, he could only hold on for 5 hours to 6 hours at most. However, he still stayed in the 8th or 9th layer to refine his tribulation skeleton even after he had already exhausted his bloodline power. He didn't leave until the land of bone tribulation was closed. 3 months. That's too much time for me," Zen said and shook his head. After that, he suddenly drove the bone plate beneath his feet forward. It turned out that he directly crossed the 10th layer and entered the 11th layer. The water drops in the 11th layer were much more violent, and the black cracks that appeared on Zen's skin grew wider. His chaotic source spirits became twice as exhausted, but the refining speed of the tribulation skeleton also increased several times. The member of the sturdy bull race clearly knew the benefits of entering the 11th layer. Once one was strong enough to withstand the water droplets in the 11th layer, their cultivation speed would greatly increase. However, it was already hard for him to stay in the 10th layer for 6 hours due to his current strength. He wondered if he could hold on for even 5 minutes in the 11th layer. In the end, he decided not to enter the 11th layer before his tribulation skeleton reached a higher level. On the other hand, Zen barely spent time in the 10th layer before he advanced further into the 11th layer. Was his body strong enough to withstand the water drops, rapidly increasing power? Easy does it, my friend. The difficulty of the 11th layer is. Before the member of the sturdy bull race could finish his warning, Zen had arrived steadily at the 11th layer. He looked back at the member of the sturdy bull race and said, "Sorry. What was that you said?" "It's nothing. Never mind." The sturdy bull waved his hands and smiled awkwardly. He realized that his worries were completely unnecessary. The tribulation skeleton's refining speed in the 11th layer increased greatly, and at the same time, the pressure Zen felt also intensified by several degrees. Even so, the exhaustion of the chaotic source spirits was still within his control. At that moment, all the remaining other shore creatures in the myriad tribulation storm observed Zen and started to discuss among themselves. How is this possible? Even if he cultivates some special theurgy, he won't be able to hold on for long, right? You should know that his tribulation skeleton hasn't grown so strong to protect his body. Even the centipede that fully concentrated on his cultivation in the 16th layer turned his head, his eyes filled with bewilderment and uncertainty. The centipede had reached his current level through step-by-step improvement. His physical body was already strong enough to bear the water drops in the outer layers, so his tribulation skeleton could grow stronger much faster. In turn, his enhanced tribulation skeleton served as additional protection as he advanced further. However, Zen had rushed into the 11th layer even though he hardly spent time in the outer layers. His tribulation skeleton was barely refined, so it couldn't support him at all. If the centipede stayed in the 11th layer without the protection of the tribulation skeleton, he wouldn't be able to withstand the water drops. Most of the other shore creatures who bet that Zen wouldn't be able to stay long in the 11th layer were indeed right. It had only been 5 minutes since he had arrived there, but he already felt dissatisfied with the refining speed in the 11th layer. Chapter 3360, Sudden Change. With everyone looking on, Zen drove the bone plate forward once more. He passed the 12th layer, the 13th layer, the 14th layer, the 15th layer, the 16th layer. He moved inwards for 160 feet and finally arrived beside the centipede-like creature. Crack, 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 the small water drops within the 16th layer rained down hard on Zen like a violent storm. His whole body was wrapped in the black cracks that tore wildly at his body. The chaotic source spirits in his body continued to absorb the battering he took, but they dimmed fast at the same time. As the chaotic source spirits dimmed, the truth of godly way continued to gush out. The warm current was like the water of an oasis in a desert, nourishing everything it flowed over. Before the chaotic source spirits fell into absolute fatigue, the truth of godly way had already restored them. I'll stay here, Zen thought to himself, assessing the situation. This was a point of perfect balance for him. If he continued onward, his chaotic source spirits might not be able to withstand the force. Once they were fatigued, Zen would not be able to hold on much longer. And on the 16th layer, he could not only refine his tribulation skeleton quickly, but he could also cultivate the chaotic source spirits at the same time. Crack, crack, crack. Countless small drops of water fell on the surface of his tribulation skeleton, and wisps of golden light swiftly covered it. Passing the trial of the land of bone tribulation usually took a long time because the tribulation skeleton would only begin refining on the outermost layer. But as the refining effect was so unsatisfactory on the outer layers, it would take a long time surely to complete the trial. In fact, from the 16th layer onward, the speed of refining would increase greatly. What is he? He went straight to the 16th layer. If I were there, I'm afraid those little water drops would tear me apart. They had just been thinking Zen wouldn't last long on the 11th layer, yet now he stood steadily on the 16th layer. Getting there would take most of them a great deal of time, but he did it in an instant. His speed stunned the other shore creatures to their core. Is this real? How ridiculous. I finally understand why the element spirit race wants him dealt with. Such rapid growth would pose a terrible threat to anyone. When the centipede stared at Zen, the rings on his body began to crack. His cultivation method relied on his extremely powerful belief. The stronger his confidence was in himself, the stronger the protection power of the rings would be. With the help of this theurgy, the centipede, like Zen, had also crossed the first 6 layers in an instant and entered directly into the 7th layer for cultivation. His speed was clearly far beyond the others. This gave him massive confidence, making him feel as though he was the most talented there was. Thus, the power of his rings was greatly increased. Soon, after his tribulation skeleton grew stronger, he would be able to enter the 17th layer. If he then passed another 3 layers, he would be able to obtain the myriad tribulation's body. Imagining how powerful he would become once he fused with his tribulation skeleton excited him a whole lot. The centipede was silent not because this was his personality, but because he felt that he was special and decided not to communicate with the others. It was true the others that entered the land of bone tribulation were also outstanding in their respective races, but he was still above them. Now however, Zen had brutally shattered his stable and confident state of mind. It was his first time in the land of bone tribulation, and yet here he was, on the same layer as he was. Such a talent was unheard of. The centipede cried out in his heart continuously. No matter how hard he tried to deny this, even closing his eyes again and again in the hope it wasn't real, Zen was still sitting steadily beside him. The undeniable fact that he was not the greatest ever began to discourage the centipede. His cultivation method had its flaw and cracks began appearing on the rings. Seeing that his theurgy was no longer able to help him resist the small water drops of the 16th layer, he had no choice but to retreat back 10 feet and enter the 15th layer. Crack, 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 but even the water drops of the 15th layer still tore his rings and forced him to continue his retreat. On the 14th layer, he retreated again. On the 13th layer, he retreated again. On the 12th layer, he retreated again. He finally stopped on the 11th layer, only 10 feet away from the sturdy bull. The centipede's downfall attracted the whispers of the other creatures. They had cultivated together for so long and knew what kind of theurgy they each used. They also knew that the centipede's body protection theurgy was connected to his state of mind. It seemed that Zen's performance had dealt a heavy blow to the centipede. Of course, Zen didn't know he had unwittingly made the centipede retreat again and again. After maintaining balance, Zen also calmed down and sat upright on the bone plate to be baptized by small drops of water. 1 day passed, 2 days passed, 3 days passed. In the myriad tribulation storm, all that could be heard was the patter of the small drops of water that smashed onto everyone's body. Occasionally, when the other shore creatures couldn't bear it, they would retreat 10 feet. If they felt that their condition had improved, they would advance back 10 feet. When the centipede was on the 11th layer, he did a lot of self-reflection, and after calming down, he advanced 20 feet and entered the 13th layer once more. 10 days passed, 20 days passed. The chaotic source spirits in Zen's body had experienced an unprecedented torture. At the same time being repaired by the truth of godly way, the chaotic source spirits didn't take a break. Zen had often performed this kind of oppression after he came out of the chaotic source world. It was thanks to this method he was able to step into the later stage of the chaotic source realm in such a short period of time. However, after staying in the myriad tribulation storm for 28 days, his chaotic source spirits finally encountered some issues. They had integrated into his body and suddenly disappeared and changed into another form. This process caused them to no longer absorb energy for him. Crack, 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 crack. When the tiny water drops struck the surface of his body, it immediately caused a terribly intense pain. What's going on? The pain had shocked Zen. He had no choice but to protect his head with both hands and drive the bone plate to retreat. His body had originally been as sturdy as a weapon. Moreover, in the past nearly a month, the tribulation skeleton had been greatly enhanced to protect him. If not for this, the moment the chaotic source spirits disappeared, the black cracks that the small water drops created would have torn him to pieces. After retreating to the outermost layer of the myriad tribulation storm, Zen stopped. The surface of his body looked horrible and was covered in wounds caused by the black cracks that burst out.